Chapter 271. Brother will bear it. Yiling looked at Yi Xian and her heart was filled with happiness. She walked towards Yi Xian and gently hugged Yi Xian's arm and gave a sweet smile. I'll bear it together with brother. Hearing that, Yi Xian couldn't help but burst out laughing. At this moment, Xueqi suddenly said, this time round, just Sky Cloud City alone has at least 3 true Imperial Magic Realm experts. And in the dark, there must be other strong practitioners from the Realm Protection Alliance. If you bring her out, the both of you will definitely die today. Yi Xian smiled. Otherwise, what should we do? Xueqi looked straight at Yi Xian and transmitted her profound qi. Yi Xian, you should be very clear that the Realm Protection Alliance's real target is you. As long as you go out, then Yiling will be safe. Yi Xian shook his head and laughed. What you mean is, I should surrender and let them do whatever they want to me, in exchange for my sister's safety, right? Xueqi replied calmly, that will depend on your own choice. If I surrender, but they still refuse to let my sister off? Yi Xian asked. Xueqi frowned slightly. Their target is only you. Yi Xian shook his head and interrupted Xueqi's words. Surrender? How stupid do I have to be to do such a silly thing? He had never placed his hopes on others, especially on the enemy. Believing that the enemy would be benevolent? Only a fool would believe that. Yi Xian walked in front of Xueqi. Now, Cold North Sect has 2 choices. First, protect my sister and directly send out their top exponents to start a war with Sky Cloud City and the Realm Protection Alliance. Second, I will bring my sister away and all the consequences will be borne by the both of us. Attitude. What he wanted now was Cold North Sect's attitude. Hearing Yi Xian's words, the entire scene suddenly quietened down. Yi Xian's attitude was very clear. Leaving Yiling behind would mean that Cold North Sect would start a war with Sky Cloud City and the Realm Protection Alliance. If he chose the second option, it meant that Yi Xian would take Yiling with him, and nothing would happen to the Frigid North Sect. 2 choices. This was a big problem for the Frigid North Sect. Because the Frigid North Sect had already paid a huge price to train Yiling. If they gave up now, it would be a huge loss. But if they didn't give up, it meant that they had to face Sky Cloud City and the Realm Protection Alliance. The current Frigid North Sect might be able to fight against these 2 forces, but they would definitely lose in the end. Should he fight or not? Everyone in the surroundings gazed at Xueqi. Yi Xian was also waiting for Xueqi's answer. In fact, the Frigid North Sect had a third option, which was to capture Yi Xian and hand Yi Xian over to the Realm Protection Alliance. In that case,
at this point,
the Realm
he raised his
Protection
head towards
Alliance
the
might
sky,
let go of
and a trace
Yiling.
of savagery appeared
However,
on his face.
Xueqi
Supreme
didn't
Lord
dare
Lu,
to touch Yi
Realm
Xian
Defense
and
Alliance.
Yi
If she
Ling.
touched
Do you really
Yi
think
Xian,
you can dominate
not
the
only would
firmament
she
or defend the
astonishment
forces
appear
behind
at
Yi
this
Xian?
time,
She
she would
would
also
man appeared
completely
not
offend
far. They
Yi
noticed
Ling.
that Yi Xian and
This
Yi Ling
person was
was
the
the
Grand
grand
Elder
elder
of the
sect.
Realm
Lu
Defense
Feng
Alliance.
didn't even dare to
Emotion
mention
about
consequences.
in the
Realm
voice.
Defense
At this
Alliance.
moment,
Lu
his
Fen
status was
exactly
second
said
only
only
to
to
Sect
Master
Master
Lu.
the Sacred Lady is a human.
said in a low
But aren't
voice.
the thousands of
A
frigid
person
North
that
Sect
Yen
disciples
you may be
always
relying on that mysterious
war
master of
breaks out.
yours. Lu
But
Feng
how many
expression
think that our Realm
instantly
Defense
became
Alliance
slightly
cannot deal with
undecided.
He was standing beside
A person
Yi
that
Xian
even
when
exalted
Lu
Lord
Yi
Lu
Xian
is
grinned.
fearful of.
This old hag is
How
very
strong
evil.
would such a
You couldn't
person
do
have to
anything
be
to
to
my
Yiling's
master.
words?
Let
But
alone
Lu
now
Fen was
Lord Lu
furious.
feel
A
fearful.
thousand years ago,
right at this moment,
emotion
not
eyes
fast
was
cut
narrowed.
throat
Suddenly opened.
What do you mean?
And a black
power
robed
was
man
just
walked
walked
out.
softly
Said,
the black
not
robed
nothing
man
much.
his hands behind
Shen
his back.
seems that your
Realm
realm
Defense
saw that I
Alliance
was
enveloped
enveloped
by
because you
black
have the
cloud.
confidence to
So
deal
his
with my
face
master.
couldn't be
After a
seen at
while,
all.
if that's the
sighed
case,
and turned around.
then follow me.
Take her away.
As he finished speaking,
away.
he walked to Yiling.
As soon as she said that, their
pulling
eyes
Yiling's
were
little
filled
hands
instantly
laughed into
some
the
of the
frigid
because the
North
black
Sect
robed man
was
was
around
around
and the
them
others
either.
exchanged
But they felt as if the black
However,
robed
a moment
man
some of the
later,
frigid
and
North
Sect
Sect
and when their
disciples were a
divine
little
sad
sad.
swept past
This
the black
chapter
robed
is
man
not
this
over.
way.
It was
Yi
actually
Xian
ended
led a
an
group of
and
true
couldn't sense
defensive
anything
Lord
at all.
Realm
Had some
towards
feelings
Master
for
Yiling,
This person
especially
Shen
Granny
was
Lang.
standing right in
The
front
moment
without
Shen
the
Wei
slightest
Yang
notice.
made her
Someone
decision,
as strong
she
as
along the
exalted
way,
Lord Lu.
Sect
He
Master
talked and laughed
she is
a
the
little.
future
Sister
hope of the frigid
Yiling,
North
as
Sect.
if he had someone to
Should we
rely
give up
on.
on her, the
And
frigid
behind
North
Yi
Sect,
Xian,
he maintained
Lu
a calm
Xiao
expression
and the
as he
others
cupped
looked
his
somewhat
human.
solemn.
What
But
is
are
your
the
rest
rest
of the
of the
frigid
Xian
North
appeared
Sect
not
not
human?
human?
Meant
If
that
thou
Yi Xian
wouldst
had
have
nothing to
North
fear.
Sect
You don't
disciples
and it
die
also meant that
because
Yi
of
Xian
know
was
this
not
afraid
afraid
of
of
the
the
Realm
Defense
Defense
Alliance.
Alliance
Where is
at
that
all.
exalted
Behind
Behind
Li
Li
wanted to say
Tell
something,
him to
but
come
more
and
than
die.
that shook her head.
Exalted
Xiao
Lord
and the
Liu
others
can't
looked
start a war.
dignified.
The realm defense
Their
alliance
hearts
is secretly
secretly
on
guard.
guard.
Said in a low voice,
Even if we start a
although
war,
an unknown
you
amount of
might not
time,
be able to
my
protect
realm
her.
protection
And
alliance
her
will
heart
not
allow
allow
anyone
outside
to
bully
bully
and
and
humiliate us.
So there's
And
not
then
much
came
point
to
in
bully
bullying
and
her.
humiliate.
Before long,
Lu Yun
the black-robed
Yi
man
Shen
sneered.
Sect
Not
master
as far in
bullying
bullying
your
him.
realm
Even if the
protection
frigid
alliance
North sect
starts
starts
or
a
is it
war
your
for
realm
her,
protection
Yi
alliance
vows deeply
not
toward
only
her.
will she die,
You've acted
and
against my
everyone
discipline
disappointing
time and
disciples
time again.
It doesn't matter if
Is it very
Yi
comfortable
Ling
to
heard
bully
the
the
Weak
weak
sect
as
disappears from the
Emma
world.
Xio was about
and
to
his little sister man suddenly flicked his
Granny
sleeve.
Lang
Looked at the crowd
scrambled
her head with a sigh.
Their divine
Go back
sense
and
is
tell
frigid
that
North
Lu
that
that this
this
Lord will be going to the realm protection alliance.
Everyone's
expression
instantly
became solemn.
Tell
The
him to
cultivators
wait.
of the divine sense swept over the fact that Xiao and the others' expressions became incomparably ugly on our most monstrous genius to protect themselves. His expression was
They were supposed to
scram
just like
hands
that,
with trembling
but if they
frigid
didn't
North
scram,
at this
then not
moment
to mention
Lu
others
Yun
suddenly
said
said
coldly,
even Master
Xiao himself
there
wouldn't dare attack.
is fighting the
But
realm
because
defense
this
alliance
person was
considered
truly too
courage?
unfathomable.
As the frigid North
facing the black robed man was like facing the vast starry sky.
Wanting to start a war with
even
the
if
realm
he had
defense
flown as a
alliance,
trump card,
the
the
frigid
frigid
North
North
still
sect
didn't
may
have the
cease to
slightest
exist.
confidence in his heart.
Is
But
courage
courage
more
more
important
important
than
or the
he
thousands
returned
of
the
disciples
disciples
between
between
his legs
pushed the door
more
open and
important?
entered.
Granny
As soon
Lang
as the
ignored
black-robed
Lu
man
Yun
and looked at
speaking.
Shen Weiyang.
He
Shen
directly turned
Weiyang
around
remained
and walked
silent.
towards the cottage.
Next to her,
Meanwhile,
Yi
Mo
Shen
Xiao
pulled
gritted
Yi
his
Ling
teeth
out of
and
the
said,
hall.
I
As
want
if
to
he had
seek
thought of
guidance
something,
from your excellency.
Yi Shen stopped at the entrance of the hall with Yi
from
Ling.
him.
The
He turned
black-robed
around
man
and said,
suddenly stopped
"We siblings
moving. Clearly distinguish between
P.S.
gratitude and grudges.
I asked around.
The frigid North
If you go
sect
to a
must have spent a
KTV
lot
and
to
become a
nurture
young
my
master,
sister.
then
We
you
can
won't
earn
take
at least
advantage of
1,000 a
her.
night. With that,
Brothers,
he pointed a
don't
finger.
be sad if
and
I
a
don't
storage
update
ring
anymore
flew to
one
Shen
day.
Weiyang. That proves
Shen
that
Weiyang
I
was about to refuse.
have a better future.
But when she scanned the ring
all
with her
of you
divine
have to be
sense
happy
and
for
discovered
me,
that there were 1
understand?
billion supreme-grade spirit stones inside, she immediately
Chapter
swallowed her words.
273. 1
Let's
billion
exchange a few
supreme-grade
moves.
spirit stones.
Obviously,
This was not a small
Mo Xiao
amount.
wanted to test the
Especially in this
black-robed
era where
man's
spirit
strength.
chi was thin.
The black-robed man
This
stood
many
in front of the
supreme-grade
wooden hut for a
spirit
while
stones
before
could be
shaking
used
his
for
head.
too many things.
You don't have the
Shen
qualifications.
Weiyang put the ring away
You
and
are only
glanced
fit
at
to
Yi
fight
Shen
my
and Yi
disciple.
Ling. In the
As
end,
he finished
she looked at
speaking,
Yi Ling.
he walked into the
You have
wooden
the
hut.
sacred relic of the
Mo
frigid
Xiao's
North expression was slightly
It's
ugly.
not a good time to
At this
take it by
moment,
force.
Yi Shen
I hope
walked
that
out
you
from
can
the wooden
return
hut.
it in the future.
Yi Shen walked
Yi
in front
Ling
of the
nodded.
black-robed man.
I'll
If you
return
want
it
to
to the
challenge
frigid
my
North
master,
sect if I
then
can.
you have to pass me
Shen
first.
Weiyang nodded and did
Mo
not say
Xiao
anything
stared at
else.
Yi Shen just when
You
Yi
don't have
Shen
the
was about to leave with Yi
qualifications.
Ling. As
Yi
he
Ling
finished
pointed
speaking,
at Granny
he
Lang.
glanced at the wooden hut
Brother,
and said, Granny
if you
Lang
don't want to
treats me
exchange
very
pointers
well,
with me,
then
please
please
forgive
forgive
me
Yi
for
Ling's
offending
head
you.
gently.
Then
As he
spoke,
pointed his
he was
finger,
about to
and a
attack.
storage ring
At
flew
this
in front
moment,
of Granny
Yi
Lang.
Shen suddenly
There
said,
were 1 billion
"Do you really want to know my
supreme-grade
master's
spirit stones in the
background?"
storage ring.
Mo
Granny
Xiao
Lang
looked
was
at Yi
moved.
Shen.
1
Yi
billion
Shen shook his head
supreme-grade
inside.
spirit stones was
Forget
actually
it.
quite a fortune
Since
to
you
her.
want to know so
No,
much,
it should be a lot.
then I will tell you.
Just then, as
Yi
he
Ling
finished
waved at
speaking,
Granny Lang.
he pointed with
Granny
his finger
Lang,
and a sword
brother
flew in
and I
front
will
of
come
Mo
back to
Xiao.
see you in the future.
Exquisite spirit
that,
sword. The two
no,
siblings left
its
the
original
hall.
name should
In
be
the
Ling
hall,
Xiao.
Granny Lang sighed.
When he saw this sword,
Actually,
Mo
she had
Xiao
been
was
worried
slightly
since the
stunned
beginning
and
that the
didn't
frigid North
understand.
sect would not
But
be
when
able
he
to
saw the
withstand
two
the pressure
words on
from
the
the Realm
sword,
Protection
it
Alliance.
was like he was struck by
However,
lightning and his
her
mind
worry
went
became
blank.
reality in the
Ling
end.
Xiao.
This
time,
sword was
the
the
frigid
sword of the
North sect
firmament
had
sword
not only
master,
lost a super genius,
firmament sword
but
master,
also lost their pride
who
and
in the
dignity.
firmament world didn't know this person.
Outside the hall,
That year,
Yi
it
Shen
was
held
this
Yi
person who
Ling's hand
suppressed
and
the
walked
Realm
out.
Defense Alliance for
Yi
almost
Ling's
100
face was
years.
filled with a bright
At
smile.
this moment,
On
Mo
the way,
Xiao's heart
Yi
was
Ling
like a
suddenly
raging
asked,
sea.
"Brother,
Yi
if the
Shen
frigid
didn't
North
say
sect
anything
starts
else.
a war with the Realm
He
Protection
smiled
Alliance because of
coldly
me,
and then recalled
will you
his
really
sword.
let me stay in the
He
frigid
turned
North
around
sect?
and walked back into the
Yi
hut.
Shen nodded.
Only Yi
This
Ling was
chapter
in the
is
hut.
not finished.
When she saw Yi
Please
Shen,
continue.
Yi Ling blinked and
Yes,
smiled like a
because
crescent
staying
moon.
in the frigid North
Yi
sect
Shen
will
sat
benefit
beside
you a
Yi
lot.
Ling and held Yi Ling's
Actually,
hand.
there was
Just
something
like
that
he did not say.
The two of them waited
If the frigid
quietly.
North sect was really
If Mo
willing to
Xiao
fight the
didn't
Realm
stop,
Protection Alliance to
then
the
the
death
two
for
of them would
Ling.
have to fight with
Then
their
he would go
lives
out
on the
and
line.
attract all the hatred to
Outside
himself.
the hut, not only would he not let
expression
Yi
was
Ling face
extremely
the Realm
ugly,
Protection Alliance,
he didn't
he
expect
would
that
also
the
not let the
firmament
Sword
frigid
Master
North
was
sect
behind
face
the
the
Realm
Yi
Protection
Xian.
Alliance.
Firmament Sword
What Yi
Master.
Xian wanted was an
1,000
attitude
years
from
ago,
the frigid
the
North
Firmament
sect,
Sword Master
an
suddenly
attitude towards
disappeared.
Yi Ling.
At that
And
time,
he was
many people
disappointed.
guessed that the Firmament Sword
He knew
Master
that if
had
it was
left
not for
Azure
him,
World or had
if Yi
fallen.
Ling stayed in the
Emo
frigid
Shio
North sect,
didn't expect that
she
the
might be
Sword Master
abandoned by
had
the frigid
fallen
North
and had
sect in the
returned to
future.
world. As if he
This
had thought of
wasn't
something.
good.
Emo
He lowered
Shio
his head
directly
and looked
turned
at Yi
around
Ling.
and led everyone
Is it the
away.
frigid North sect's
Now he
fault?
had to report this
Yi Ling
matter to the
lowered her head
higher-ups.
slightly and kept
One
quiet.
had to know that Song
After a
Jie
while,
Swordhead didn't
she
have a
looked
good
up at Yi
relationship with the
Xian.
World Protecting
Do you
Alliance.
think I'm wrong?
Especially this time,
Yi
the
Xian
Realm
rubbed Yi
Defense
Ling's
Alliance
little
was
head
against
and
Yi
smiled.
Xian. And
Not
Yi
at
Xian
all.
was the disciple
Remember,
of the Firmament Sword
no
Master.
one is born to
Emo
owe anyone
Yi Xian.
anything.
And Yi, the frigid North sect does not owe me,
Yi
nor do
Xiao.
they owe you. If they
Wait.
are willing to fight the
Yi
Realm
Mo
Protection
Mo
Alliance
with
to the death
Mo.
for you, with
I will be
foam
grateful
and
for
embark
it
for the rest of my life.
If they are
Sword
not
with
willing,
MO was
it's
MO.
all right. If he used it once and killed Mashio and the others, Yiling nodded her little head. At
I
that
understand.
time, he and his sister
Oh,
would be
brother,
finished.
sometimes I feel
Without
that you are
thinking
very
too
long-winded.
Yi
But I
Shen
also
pulled
like to
Yiling
hear
out
you
of the
being
hut and
long-winded.
fled towards the vast
Hearing
mountain
that,
range. Yi Shen
brother,
instantly
you
burst
still
out
don't
laughing.
open your eyes.
He doted on
Is it
Yiling,
because you
but he would
haven't
not
finished
spoil
cultivating
Yiling,
the peerless
because
technique?
spoiling a person would
And
often be
there's
harming
still
the person.
some time.
Just
If
at this
I
moment,
succeed,
the
will I
siblings
be
stopped.
very powerful?
In the distant
Yes,
sky,
I can kill
stood
high
a
middle-aged
middle-aged
man.
man.
Look, beside him
Woo.
there was a young
Although
man.
it sounds like I'm bragging,
Skycloud City's
I
City
still
Lord
believe
Lu
in
Feng
brother and young city
Yi
lord Lu
Shen.
Xianming. After an
Behind
unknown
the
amount
two
of
of them
time stood three
Yi
elders.
Shen
Suddenly stopped
The three
and
of
turned
them were
around.
all true Imperial
Not
Realm
far from his
experts,
right stood a woman,
including Lu Feng.
The woman was wearing
There were
a green
total of
dress
4
and a
true
veil.
Imperial Realm
At
experts.
this moment,
Other
the
than
woman
that,
was staring at
there
him.
were 10 over
The
people
veiled
around
woman
them.
slowly walked
These
up to
people
Yi
were
Shen
all in
and
the
Yiling.
Imperial Realm.
She sized
This
up Yi
lineup was
Shen
enough to easily
True
take down
10,000
Azure Province.
Dharma realm.
But in the
Sword
divine central
sovereign.
continent,
Two
it was
sword
probably
intense.
just average.
Not bad
Not
indeed.
far in front of Yi Shen.
Yi Shen said.
Lu Xianming
You
glared
are.
at Yi Shen.
The veiled woman
Bastard.
said,
Did
Shen
you do
Gate.
this?
Mu Zhaoling.
Yi Shen frowned.
Shen Gate.
Who are you talking
Yi
about,
Shen
bastard?
frowned slightly.
You, of course. He had
Lu
naturally heard of
Xianming
this
said
force.
fiercely, among
You
the
lowly
lower realms
bastard.
of the central
At this
divine
point, he was
continent,
stunned.
this Shen
Something
Gate was
seemed
ranked number
wrong.
1. Opposite
The past
him,
number 1 on
Yi
the
Shen
monster
nodded.
ranking had all
He
come
said
from the Shen
seriously,
Gate. That
Yi
scumbag
Shen
is talking
collected
about
his
me.
thoughts and asked,
Beside
What's the
Yi
matter?
Shen,
The
Yiling
veiled
could
woman
not help
sized
but
him
cover
up.
her mouth and laugh.
I'm here to recruit
people.
Lu
Recruit
Xianming
people.
roared. Then
Yi
directly
Shen was
rushed
stunned.
towards Yi Shen.
Then he turned to
the
Yiling
moment
and
Lu
said with some
Xianming
pride,
rushed out.
Look,
Lu
your
Feng's
brother is
expression
so
changed
outstanding.
greatly.
I've
He was
just
about to
arrived
make
at
a
the
move,
central divine
but at this
continent,
time,
and I've
not
already
far
caught
away,
the eye of the
Lu
Shen Gate.
Xianming stopped. Yiling
Between his
smiled
brows,
brilliantly.
there was a sword.
Big brother is
Lu
amazing.
Xianming looked at Yi Shen in
course.
disbelief.
Yi Shen
He
said
did not
seriously,
expect that he would be defeated
although I've
just
been
like
very
that.
low-key, there's a saying.
He did not even have
If
the
it's
strength
gold,
to fight
it
back.
will shine. Lu Feng
your
stared
brother
at Yi
am.
Shen.
Excuse
Excuse me.
dare to hurt a hair
At this
on his
moment,
head.
Mu Zhaoling,
At this
who was
time,
not far away,
Yi Shen
suddenly
held the
said,
sword and slashed
I'm not
down.
here for you.
Swoosh.
Speaking of this,
Lu
she
Xuanming's
pointed to
entire
Yiling.
arm was
I'm
sent
here
flying.
for her.
Yiling was
Lu
stunned.
Xianming
Yi
immediately
Shen was
screamed
also
like a pig
stunned.
being slaughtered.
At this moment,
Yi Shen
time
looked at
seemed
Lu
to
Feng and
freeze.
smiled viciously.
After a moment,
How dare
Yi
you
Shen
have designs
laughed.
on my sister?
After relieving himself
Do you know
of
how
the
to write the word
embarrassment,
death?
he gently rubbed
As he
Yiling's
said
little
this,
head.
he swung the sword.
Your Shen Gate has a
Swoosh.
good eye.
Lu Xuanming's
Speaking
head
of this,
was sent
he turned to
flying.
look at Mu Zhaoling.
At the same time,
Actually,
Yi Shen quickly
I'm not
swung
bad.
the sword.
Won't you
Soon,
consider it?
Lu Xuanming's body
Mu
was
Zhaoling
instantly
shook her head.
disintegrated into the word
No.
death.
Yi Shen sighed softly.
Yi Shen turned around
This is
and
2F
pointed at Lu
asterisk
Feng
king
with the sword.
frustrating.
Do you
Mu
understand
Zhaoling
how to
glanced
write
at
it
Yi
like
Shen.
this?
It's not that you're not good
End
enough.
of this chapter.
It's that you're too good. If you didn't have a conflict with the
Chapter
Realm Protection
272.
Alliance, entering my
Rage.
Shen Gate would
Yi
naturally
Shen was
not
naturally
be a problem.
enraged.
Unfortunately,
Whoever dared to harm his
Yi
sister,
Shen calmly said,
Yi Shen would not rest
so you're
until he
afraid
was
of
dead.
the Realm Protection
For
Alliance,
his
just
sister,
like the Frigid
Yi
North
Shen
sect.
was not afraid of anything.
Mu Zhaoling sneered.
Nearby, Lu
What is
Feng's
the Frigid
expression
North
turned
sect?
savage when he saw
How
Lu
can they be
Xianming
compared to
being
my Shen
dismembered.
Gate?
In the next
And
moment,
my Shen
he
Gate is
charged
not
at Yi
afraid of the
Shen
Realm
with a shake of
Protection
his body.
Alliance. Due to his incredible speed, the person
Lu
who wants
Feng
to kill
caused
you
the
is
space
not
around
Lord
him
Lu,
to tremble.
but someone
It was a
above Lord
terrifying
Lu.
sight to behold.
If we accept you now,
It was rare to see
it's
someone
clear that
in
we're
the
not
true
giving
imperial
face to
magic
the Realm
realm to be
Protection
able to move
Alliance
so quickly.
At that time,
If it had been the
both
Yi Shen
forces
of the
will be
past,
embarrassed.
he would
My
not have
Shen
been able
Gate
to
is
fight
not
back
afraid of
against
the
a
Realm
cultivator
Protection
of this level.
Alliance.
But
we
now,
don't want
with
to
the
become
law of
enemies
space,
with them.
he could fight
Yi
against a
Shen
true
lightly
imperial
said.
magic realm
Now, the
cultivator.
person you want to
As
accept
soon as
is
Lu
my
Feng
sister.
disappeared from where he
Mu
stood,
Zhaoling
Yi
shook her
Shen
head.
leaped up and slashed
As long
down
as
with
we
his
don't
sword.
accept you,
Boom.
no matter how
In the
overbearing
sky,
the Realm
along
Protection
with the sound
Alliance
of an
is,
explosion,
they won't take the initiative
Yi Shen
to fight with
retreated
my Shen
rapidly.
Gate.
This
Moreover,
time,
when
he
the time
retreated
comes,
nearly
we will
1,000
secretly
feet.
train her. However,
Even the Realm
Lu
Protection
Feng was
Alliance
also
won't
pushed
be
back
able
to
to
find
find
her.
200 zhang.
Speaking of this,
In the
she looked at
distance,
Yiling
Lu
this
Feng
time.
looked at his
I
palm.
came to the Frigid
His
North
palm
sect
was covered
because
in
I was
cracks,
entrusted by
which
someone
were
to
caused
find
by
her.
Yi Shen's sword.
Entrusted
Lu
by
Feng
someone?
narrowed his eyes.
Yi Shen was
There
stunned,
was
then
less less contempt in his eyes
Entrusted
and
by
more
who?
seriousness.
Mu Xiaoling looked at Yi
On the
Xian,
other hand,
was
senior
excited.
sister N.
He
Senior
realized that after
sister
borrowing
N.
the law of
Yi
space,
Xian and his
the gap
younger
between
sister
him
were
and a true
instantly
imperial
struck
magic
dumb.
realm
And
cultivator
Lan
was not
Xiao.
that great. However,
He could
the
fight
brother and
back.
sister were still a little
With this thought in
uncertain,
mind,
so Yi
Yi
Xian quickly
Xian's
asked,
fighting spirit
"Is
sword.
it in Lan Xiao?"
He pointed at Lu
Mu
Feng and
Xiaoling
pointed
nodded.
at him. Yi
Huang.
Xian said
The
in a
sound
deep
of a
voice.
sword suddenly
She
rang
has already
out.
entered the Xian
Then,
gate?
a flying
Mu
sword suddenly
Xiaoling
flew
nodded
out from the sword
slightly.
case on his back and
Yes,
slashed at
this
Lu
time,
Feng. She should have
Lu
come
Feng
personally,
was
but she was
expressionless.
delayed.
He
So
pulled
she
with
asked me
both
to come to the
hands,
frigid
and the
North
space
sect
in
to
front
pick
of
up his
him
sister.
immediately distorted.
Of course, if the
When the
frigid
flying
North sect
sword
and the
entered
Realm
the
Protection
distorted
Alliance
space,
were to fight to
it
the
was
death,
immediately
I would
blocked,
come forward to
unable
mediate,
to move even an
but I
inch
didn't
further.
expect that you would appear
Seeing this
halfway.
scene,
Yi
Yi
Xian
Xian's
was
heart
about to
skipped a
speak
beat.
when Yi Ling
A
suddenly
true
said,
Dharma realm
"I am
expert's
willing
use
to
of the
enter the
power of
Xian
space
gate" was even more
Yi
terrifying
Xian
than he
looked
had
at
imagined.
Yi Ling looked
Without
at Yi
thinking
Xian
too
and
much,
grinned.
Yi Xian pointed with his finger,
I know that if I continue to follow you, I will become your burden.
Back to him.
I don't want to drag you down.
Out to grab the sword
I really don't want to drag
abruptly
you down.
stomped on the ground with his
As she
right
spoke,
foot. Her face was already covered with
transformed
tears.
into a streak
Yi
of sword
Xian
light
shook
and
his head
shot forward.
He held
Yi
Ling in his
a ray
arms.
of light flashed through
Silly
the
girl,
battlefield.
if you follow me,
In the distance,
you will never become
Lu
my
Feng's
burden.
face was incomparably
Ling
cold.
hugged Yi Xian tightly,
To a true defensive
sobbing
magic
uncontrollably.
realm expert.
Everyone
I
below
also
him
want to
was
follow
nothing
you,
more than
but
an ant.
Grandma Lung is
After
right.
all,
I
there
was a
can't always
qualitative
rely on
difference
you.
between a
I
true
have
defensive
to learn to
magic
grow.
realm expert and an ordinary
Yi Xian
one.
was about to say
At
something.
this moment, not
the
far
Yi
away,
Xian in front of
Mu
him was
Xiaoling
not even in the
said,
Dharma defensive
the
realm,
Realm Protection
but he
Alliance
dared
will
to
not
attack
let you
him
go.
twice.
They will continue to
him,
attack you.
This was an
Keeping
insult.
her by your side,
However,
is not
Lu
a
Feng
good
did
thing
not
for
look
you
down
and
on
her.
Yi Xian because he
Looking
knew that
at
there were
Yi
some
Ling's
people in this
tears,
world that could not be
Yi
looked at
Xian's
normally.
heart felt like it was being cut
Lu
by a
Feng
knife.
gently pressed his
Brother,
right hand forward,
don't blame me,
causing the space
At
in
this
front of him
time,
to tremble
Yi
violently.
Ling suddenly looked up at
Following
him.
which,
She
the
wiped
space
the
began to
tears on her
compress
face
layer
and
by
revealed
layer,
a smile,
forming an invisible barrier
Gate
in
still
an
has
instant.
Sister N.
I
Spatial
will accompany
barrier.
Sister N.
And this
You
barrier
don't
had
have to worry
forcefully
about
blocked Yi
anything.
Xian's sword.
Yi Xian grinned.
Seeing that his attack had failed, Yi
He was
Xian
not an
instantly retreated
indecisive
over 30
person.
meters.
He was very
Increasing
clear
the
that
distance
letting Yi
between
Ling
him
join
and
Lu
Lu
Xian
Feng.
Gate was indeed a
Lu
good
Feng
choice.
stared fixedly at Yi Xian.
Because
No
the
matter how
matter
monstrous
between
you
him
are,
and the realm
the gap
protection
between our
alliance
realms
was
was
still
not
not
over.
If Yi Ling
Meanwhile,
followed him,
his voice
it
came
would
to an
be
abrupt
very,
halt
very
because
dangerous.
Yi Xian had already
Of
arrived
course,
before
if the
him.
Xian Gate did
At
not
the
have
same
Enlancio,
time,
a
he would
sword
not
had
let
already
Yi Ling
chopped
join
down
the
from
Xian
above
Gate no
his
matter
head.
what.
This strike
Because
was
this
even more
force was too
terrifying than the
mysterious.
previous ones.
As if
And
thinking
the
of
sword had
something,
already turned
Yi
pitch
Xian
black.
faced Mu
Evil Will's
Xiaoling.
sword
You
intent.
said that little and
Even though
asked
he
you
had
to
been
come.
caught off guard
Do you
by
have
Yi
proof?
Xian's attack,
Mu
Lu
Xiaoling
Feng
flicked her
remained
finger.
calm and fearless.
A small wooden
When the
figure
sword was
appeared
still
in
a
front
dozen
of
or
Yi
so
Ling
inches
and
away
Yi
from his
Xian.
head,
The small
he
wooden
lightly
figure and
twisted his right
Enlancio
hand.
looked at each other.
In an instant,
It was the one
the
Yi
space
Xian
above
had
his
given
head
to
where the sword
Enlancio.
was turned into a
Seeing this
spatial
small
vortex.
wooden figure,
At the
the
same
last
time,
trace of doubt
the
in Yi
energy on
Xian's
Yi
heart was
Xian's sword
dispelled.
and the evil Will
Yi
sword
Xian
intent
faced
began
Yi
to break
Ling.
down
Yi
in a
Ling
frenzy.
grinned.
The
Brother,
power of
don't
spatial
worry.
disintegration.
I will take good care
But
of
at this
myself.
moment,
A strange
there's
change
also
occurred.
Sister N. A mysterious
Yi
energy
Xian
suddenly
nodded.
enveloped Yi
Then
Xian's
she took
sword,
out a storage ring
and
and
this
handed
energy
it to Yi
actually
Ling
blocked
inside
the
the
power of
storage ring.
spatial
There
disintegration.
were 1 billion
Lu
top-grade
Feng was
spirit
greatly
stones
shocked
and a
when he
snow
saw
lotus.
this. This
Before
snow
he could
lotus
even
was an
react,
extremely
Yi
cold
Xian's
object.
sword had already
For
slashed
Yi Ling,
down.
it would
Boom.
definitely be
Before
of
the
great
eyes
use.
of the surrounding
Yi
crowd,
Ling did not
Lu
refuse.
Feng was directly sent
She
flying
accepted the
several
storage
dozen
ring
meters
and
away.
then walked in front
The
of Mu
expressions of
Xiaoling.
everyone in the
She
surroundings
smiled
became solemn
sweetly.
when they saw this scene.
Sister, let's go.
Especially those
Mu
true
Xiaoling
imperial
glanced
lore
at
realm
Yi Ling
experts.
and nodded slightly.
Because they had never
Then
imagined
she
that
pulled
Yi
Yi Ling.
Xian's sword would
At
actually
this
be
moment,
able to
a
ignore the
cold
power
air
of
suddenly
spatial
attacked her.
disintegration.
Mu Xiaoling's
Opposite Yi
expression
Xian,
did not
Lu
change.
Feng stared
Her
fixedly
lily-white
at Yi
hands
Xian.
trembled slightly.
How did you do it?
That cold air suddenly
Spatial
disappeared without a
disintegration
trace.
was the most powerful
At the same
technique of
time,
true
a
imperial
blue
lore realm
circle suddenly
experts.
appeared under
If
her
spatial
feet.
disintegration
Soon,
was ineffective
her and
against
Mu
Yi
Xiaoling's
Xian,
bodies
then
became
from a certain
illusory.
perspective, from beginning
Yi
to
Xian
end,
could already be
Yi
considered
Ling
as a
did
true
not look back
imperial
at
lore
Yi
realm
Xian.
expert. Not long
Of course,
after, to measure a
Yi
true
Ling and Mu
imperial lore realm
Xiaoling
expert
disappeared in
strength,
front of Yi
not only
Xian.
spatial
Yi
disintegration,
Xian stood in the
but
same
also
place
battle
as if he
awareness,
had been
equipment,
petrified.
martial
He
techniques,
did not recover for a
cultivation
long
techniques,
time.
and so on.
In a certain space,
Yi Xian sneered.
tears kept
How
flowing
did you
down
do
Yi
it?
Ling's face.
Lu Feng, no matter
Do you
how
know
she
why
wiped
your
them,
older brother,
the
Supreme
tears would
Lord
not
Lu,
stop flowing.
did not come personally
Mu
to
Xiaoling
capture me?
looked down at Yi Ling.
Hearing this,
Why
Lu
didn't
Feng
you turn
frowned.
around and say
What do
goodbye
you
to
mean?
him?
What
Yi
do I
Ling
mean?
wiped the tears
Yi
on her
Xian's
face.
sneer widened,
If I
and he
turned
pointed
around
his
and
sword
saw
at the
brother,
surroundings,
I couldn't
if
bear
I'm
to
not
leave
wrong,
him. There should be
as she
other
said that,
experts from the
she
Realm
hugged
Defense
Mu Xiaoling
Alliance in
and
the
cried.
surroundings.
I
But
couldn't
this
bear
Supreme
to leave
Lord Lu
brother.
of the Realm Defense
I really
Alliance
couldn't
did not
bear
come
to.
personally, right?
Chapter 274. No one knew what her brother meant to Yi Ling. Everything. Her brother was her everything. She really wanted to stay by her brother's side, but she knew that if she stayed by her brother's side, with her current strength, she would definitely become her brother's burden. Only when she left would her brother not have any worries. Moreover, she could go to Xian Gate to cultivate and become stronger so that she could help her brother in the future. However, she really couldn't bear to leave. Therefore, she didn't even have the courage to look back at Yi Xian. Because she was afraid that after seeing him, she wouldn't want to leave. Mu Zhaoling gently rubbed Yiling's little head. Parting is for a better reunion. Don't be sad. Cultivate well. Only when you are strong can you do what you want to do. As she said that, she turned back and looked. Actually, Yi Xian was totally qualified to join Xian Gate. Unfortunately, Yi Xian had too many troubles. If Xian Gate accepted him, they would be forcefully dragged into these troubles. Although Xian Gate wasn't afraid, they didn't want to fall out with the Realm Protection Alliance for Yi Xian. This wasn't in line with Xian Gate's interests. However, it was still a pity because Yi Xian was too monstrous. Mu Xiaoling sighed softly and then sped up. Not long later, she and Yiling disappeared from the scene. Realm Protection Alliance. There were only Mo Xiao and Supreme Lord Lu in the hall. The two of them didn't speak and the atmosphere was heavy. After a moment, Supreme Lord Lu suddenly said, "You have been tricked by him." Mo Xiao looked at Supreme Lord Lu. Supreme Lord Lu said calmly, "If that person is really Firmament Swordmaster, you would have died by challenging him." Mo Xiao frowned. "If it isn't Firmament Swordmaster, then who is it? You have to know that that person has no aura. Even if he is standing in front of me, I can't feel his existence." Supreme Lord Lu said coldly, "No matter who he is, since he dares to go against my Realm Protection Alliance, he isn't an ordinary person." As he said that, he looked at Mo Xiao. "Let's go. I will go with you and see who this person is." After saying that, the two of them disappeared from the hall. Not long after, High Lord Lu and Mo Xiao arrived in front of a thatched hut in a mountain range. Supremacy Lu glanced at the thatched cottage and cupped his fists. "How should I address you?" There was no movement in the thatched hut. Lord Lu narrowed his eyes. "Do you look down on me so much?" There was still no movement in the thatched hut. Lord Lu's face turned cold. With a wave of his right hand, a powerful pressure instantly swept towards the thatched cottage. Boom! The straw hut collapsed, and the inside was empty. Lord Lu and Mo Xiao were instantly stunned when they saw this scene. No one. The two of them looked at each other and Lu Xun said in a deep voice, "Let's go to the Divine Fortune-Telling Sect and check." Mo Xiao said in a low voice, "I might have to pay a price." High Lord Lu shook his head. "I don't care anymore. The Pine Prefecture's quintessence heart is about to emerge into the world. We absolutely can't allow that kid Yi Xian to spoil our plans during this period of time." Mo Xiao nodded. "Understood. The heart of origin. To the Realm Defense Alliance, this was undoubtedly the most important thing." Soon, Mo Xiao turned around and left. Lu Xun glanced at the surroundings before he left as well. After an unknown period of time, Supreme Lord Lu appeared once more, but the place was still empty. Lu Xun frowned when he saw this. "Did I sense wrongly?" As he spoke, he shook his head and turned around to leave. About an hour later, a figure suddenly appeared at the spot where Lu Xun Lord was originally standing. This person was Yi Xian. Yi Xian said softly, "That was close." Just now, Lu Xun had obviously noticed something. However, he wasn't sure himself. Although he didn't discover anything in the end, Yi Xian was still shocked. If he was discovered, he would definitely die. Because his intuition told him that with his current strength, even if he activated the World Prison Pagoda, he might not be able to kill Lu Xun. Lu Xun was obviously an expert above the true Imperial Law realm. In the future, he had to be more cautious when facing such an expert. After a while, Yi Xian turned around and left. He ran towards the depths of the mountain range and soon entered the vast mountains. Around half an hour later, Yi Xian found a dense forest. The forest was very dense and every tree was at least tens of feet tall. Even sunlight could not penetrate through. Yi Xian sat cross-legged on the ground and a small earth character quietly condensed between his brows. Dao Law. Condensing a Dao Law sword. He didn't know what the hell this Dao Law sword was, but he knew that since the mysterious woman had asked him to do this, she must have her reasons. Under Yi Xian's control, the Dao Law of Earth suddenly flew out from between his brows and floated in front of him. When this Dao Law appeared, the surrounding ground began to tremble. At the same time, endless power of the earth gathered towards the Earth Law. After a while, after absorbing the endless power of the Earth Law became brighter. The Earth Law protected the Earth and endured the trampling of all things. If it was condensed into a sword, it would naturally be the Earth Sword. Gradually, Yi Xian began to sweat profusely and his body was trembling. This was because there was too much power of the Earth. It was so much that he couldn't control it. Yi Xian gritted his teeth. Condense. As soon as he said that, the Dao Law began to tremble violently. Then, under the influx of the power of the Earth, it gradually began to change shape. Around half an hour later, the tip of the sword appeared. At the sight of this, Yi Xian was ecstatic. This Dao Law could actually condense into a sword. At that moment, the Dao Law suddenly trembled violently. Boom! endless power of the earth shook in all directions and Yi Xian was instantly sent flying hundreds of feet away. In the surroundings, the dense forest had already been flattened. Yi Xian lay on the ground and just lay there. After an unknown period of time, he slowly got up. Blood flowed continuously from the corner of his mouth. Yi Xian wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and smiled bitterly. As expected, it's not that simple. As he said that, he sat down cross-legged and began to recuperate. Around an hour later, Yi Xian continued. Judging from the power just now, if he really succeeded in condensing Halran Gaia, it would definitely be very terrifying. At the very least, it wouldn't be any weaker than a heaven-level superior-grade sword. Moreover, with the support of the earth, its power would definitely surpass a heaven-level superior-grade sword. He had to condense it. Yi Xian continued. However, it wasn't that smooth as he failed a few times. The most successful time was condensing the body of the sword. Unfortunately, this was far from enough. Continue. To Yi Xian, failure wasn't scary. What was scary was giving up. He wouldn't give up until the very last moment. Yi Xian condensed once again. Just like that, 2 days later, Yi Xian gradually began to understand some things. He couldn't condense it by force. If he condensed it by force, the power of the earth would instinctively resist. Not only the power of the earth, but even the law of earth would instinctively resist. Communicate. He communicated with the law of earth and had it cooperate with him to condense. If the law of earth cooperated, the power of the earth would cooperate. At first, it wasn't easy to communicate with it because the law of earth was a bit cold and didn't pay much attention to him. In the end, Yi Xian took out the prison pagoda. Thus, the law of earth started to cooperate. Clearly, it was giving face to the prison pagoda. Yi Xian sat cross-legged on the ground. In front of him, the law of earth rotated violently. Countless amounts of earth power gathered towards it. Gradually, the tip of a sword appeared. Seeing this, Yi Xian was overjoyed. He continued to urge the law of earth. Soon, the body of the sword also appeared. The moment the body of the sword appeared, Yi Xian didn't relax. Instead, he became even more nervous. This was because he had failed countless times because he had condensed the sword hilt. Yi Xian was fully focused. More and more earth power gathered towards the law of earth. Gradually, the sword hilt began to appear. Half an hour later. Wang! The sound of a sword suddenly rang through the sky. Success! Yi Xian lay limply on the ground. Not far away from him, a khaki-colored sword floated. The sword was 3 feet long and 2 fingers wide. It emitted a faint khaki-colored light. A moment later, Yi Xian stood up. He walked in front of the sword and grabbed its hilt. Boom! In an instant, a powerful force suddenly surged out from the sword, and the ground around him instantly cracked. The might of heaven and earth. This was the true might of heaven and earth. More accurately, it was the might of earth. When he sensed the power within the sword, Yi Xian was slightly excited. This sword was much stronger than his heaven-grade sword. As if he had thought of something, Yi Xian suddenly slashed forward with the sword. At the tip of the sword, an earth-shattering power of the earth poured out along with his sword qi. Wherever the sword qi and the power of the earth passed, the ground would crack. Moreover, the sword qi and the power of the earth had swept out for over 1,000 feet. A moment later, a huge bottomless ravine that was over 30 meters wide appeared in front of Yi Xian. The power of one sword was so terrifying. Yi Xian was a little excited. If he added the Space Dao Law to protect the sword qi and earth power of this sword, it was very likely that this sword could hurt a true Imperial Dharma Realm expert. Simply put, he now had the ability to go head-on with a true Imperial Dharma Realm expert. The only drawback was that the Halran Gaia consumed too much energy. With his current strength, he could only activate it twice a day. If he used it too much, he would definitely be exhausted to death. Yi Xian put away his sword. The word void suddenly appeared between his brows. Space Dao Law. The power of the Space Dao Law was obviously stronger than that of the Grand Dao Law. Moreover, the Space Dao Law involved more levels. What would happen if he condensed a space sword? Space sword. Yi Xian was a little excited. He quickly sat down cross-legged. Soon, the Space Dao Law between his brows flashed out. Soon, the space around him trembled violently. Space trembled. Yi Xian was shocked. The curvature of the space trembling was a little too big. After hesitating for a moment, he decided to continue trying. Soon, as he forcefully condensed it, the surrounding space started to distort. Streaks of powerful spatial energy rippled out from the surrounding space. After an unknown period of time, the surrounding space trembled violently and a sword tip quietly condensed. P.S. Sorry, I've been updating twice recently. I sincerely apologize. Today, my dad underwent a second surgery to close the wound. I hope there won't be any problems this time. Chapter 275. The tip of the sword was transparent, like the color of water. Evidently, it was condensed from spatial power. Sensing this, Yi Xian was overjoyed. He hurriedly activated the space Dao, hoping to condense the sword. At that moment, the space around him suddenly shook violently. Boom! A powerful force instantly sent Yi Xian flying. He flew hundreds of meters away. Bang! Yi Xian crashed onto the ground, causing it to crack. On the ground, Yi Xian could not help but wail. Pain! It was too painful. At that moment, he felt as if all the muscles in his body were being torn apart. It was caused by spatial power, and it had a powerful tearing ability. If not for the protection of the space Dao, he would have been shattered by this spatial power. I can't condense it for now. That was what Yi Xian was thinking. This spatial power was too powerful, and he could not control it at the moment. He had to reach the magic governing realm to truly control the spatial power. At that time, he could condense the sword of space with the space Dao. Although it was a pity, Yi Xian was satisfied, as he had already condensed the Halran Gaia. With the Halran Gaia, he could now barely resist a true defensive realm expert. Without thinking too much, Yi Xian began to heal his injuries. 2 hours later, the wounds on his body had completely healed. After recovering, Yi Xian did not leave. Instead, he began to study sword kinesis flight. He who had already reached the sword emperor level could actually use sword kinesis flight. Back in the country of Zhang, the sword emperor who had come to cause trouble for him had used sword kinesis flight. Unfortunately, he had been killed by the mysterious woman with a single strike. Sword kinesis flight. This had been his dream from the very beginning. Sword kinesis flight between heaven and earth, and he could see thousands of mountains and rivers. Thinking of this, Yi Xian felt a little excited. Sword kinesis flight. Under Yi Xian's instructions, the heaven's thunder sword floated in front of him, and he leaped onto it. The sword sank slightly, but it still lifted him up. Just like that, the heaven's thunder sword slowly moved forward under his control. It was fine at first, but the problem was that it couldn't go fast enough. Not only could it not go fast enough, but it couldn't go too high either. Otherwise, the sword would become extremely unstable. Just like that, Yi Xian pondered for nearly an entire day, but his sword still couldn't move fast enough. Not only could it not move fast, the sword could only reach 2 zhang above the ground. Any higher and it wouldn't be able to withstand it. At this moment, Yi Xian realized that the imperial sword technique wasn't that simple. Yi Xian sat cross-legged on the ground, deep in thought. If the mysterious woman was still here, then all the problems he encountered could be solved, but now the mysterious woman was not here. I can't build a car behind closed doors. He was not a peerless genius, and it was impossible for him to understand everything for no reason. He had to learn. Pale Sword Sect. Yi Xian thought of this sect, the biggest sect in the Azure world. His current understanding and learning of the Sword Dao all came from the mysterious woman. There was no need to doubt the mysterious woman's strength, but now that she was not here, it meant that he could not obtain new knowledge of the Sword Dao. At this time, if he built a car behind closed doors and blindly pondered, it might produce the opposite of the desired result. It was better to learn from the strengths of others and see more outstanding swordsmen. To the Pale Sword Sect. After Yi Xian made up his mind, he immediately set off. The Pale Sword Sect was a famous faction in the Azure world, so Yi Xian easily found the specific location of the Pale Sword Sect. The Pale Sword Sect was located on a sword mountain in the southern part of the divine central continent. The reason it was called Sword Mountain was because the mountain was like a sharp sword hanging upside down in the air, piercing the heavens. Rumor had it that this Sword Mountain, which was thousands of zhang tall, had been forcibly carved out by the Azure World Sword Master. 2 days later, Yi Xian arrived at Sword Mountain. At this time, He had slightly disguised his appearance. He had made a blood-red birthmark the size of a palm on his face, making him look extremely ugly. In addition, he had also used chaotic energy to conceal his sword emperor and true 10,000 Dharma realm aura. The current him was a sword master, and a divine unity realm cultivator. But there was no other way. If he did not disguise himself, the Realm Protection Alliance would be able to find him in a matter of minutes. One had to know that in order to capture him, the Realm Protection Alliance had released his portrait throughout the entire Azure world. At the foot of Sword Mountain, Yi Xian raised his head to look at the peak. Above him was the Pale Sword Sect. Before he came, he had done some research. The Pale Sword Sect would recruit outer disciples every year, but now was not the time to do so. Apart from this, there was another way to enter the Pale Sword Sect, and that was to recommend oneself and pass the trials. The Pale Sword Sect had 3 trials at the foot of the mountain. As long as one passed these 3 trials, he would be able to enter the Pale Sword Sect. Yi Xian came to the first trial. There was an old man lying there. The old man had his legs crossed and his eyes were slightly closed. There was a lecherous smile on his face. It was obvious that he was dreaming of something. Yi Xian cupped his fists towards the old man. "Senior, I want to pass the trials." No response. Yi Xian said again, "Senior, I want to pass the trials." This time, his voice was louder. Still no response. Yi Xian frowned. He suddenly stepped forward and grabbed the old man, shouting angrily, "I want to pass the trials." The old man opened his eyes. He was a little stunned. A moment later he shouted angrily, "Who are you?" Yi Xian let go of the old man and said calmly, "And Yi, I am here to pass the trials." The old man said angrily, "Pass what trials?" "The old man declares that you fail. Hurry up and scram." Yi Xian was expressionless. "Old man, it's not that I'm boasting, but not taking me in is the greatest loss your Pale Sword Sect has suffered in the past 1,000 years. The old man said angrily, "Stop bullshitting. With someone like you, you still think it's 1,000 years of loss?" "According to the old man, if I take you in, I'm afraid you will become the scourge of my Pale Sword Sect for 1,000 years. Yi Xian took out a true grade sword. He pointed it at the old man. "Old man, fight me one-on-one." One-on-one. The old man was stunned. He wanted to fight him one-on-one? The old man sized up Yi Xian. "Is there something wrong with your head?" Yi Xian was expressionless. "I'll give you 3 strikes. Quick, draw your sword." The old man glanced coldly at Yi Xian. "Young man, you really don't know the immensity of the heavens and the earth. Never mind, let this old man teach you how to be a person." As he spoke, he waved his right hand, and an expanse of sword light shot out violently. The myriad Dharma realm. Moreover, it was a sword master. Meanwhile, Yi Xian charged forward swiftly with his sword in hand, and then he slashed down. Hiss! The expanse of sword light was directly torn apart. The old man was stunned, and then he said with astonishment, "Sword master? You're actually a sword master?" Yi Xian put his sword away and said indifferently, "I'm the real deal." The old man's expression instantly became slightly unsightly when he heard this. Sword master. Even if such a young sword master was placed in the Pale Sword Sect, he could be considered as a top-rate disciple. He really was a genius. The old man went silent for a moment before he said, "Wait a moment." As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. On the spot, Yi Xian put his sword away and closed his eyes in meditation. Arrogant? He was naturally being arrogant intentionally. Because according to normal circumstances, he had to first become an outer court disciple, then an inner court disciple, and finally an elite disciple. And only an elite disciple could come into contact with the core of the Pale Sword Sect. This was truly too slow, and he didn't have that much time. He had to be more high-profile and directly draw the attention of the Pale Sword Sect's higher-ups. In next to no time, the old man and a middle-aged man arrived before him. The middle-aged man sized up Yi Xian. "What's your name?" Yi Xian said, "An Yi." The middle-aged man nodded lightly. "Where are you from?" Yi Xian said in a low voice, "An independent cultivator." The middle-aged man asked, "Why do you want to join the Pale Sword Sect?" Yi Xian's expression was calm. After attaining the Swordmaster realm, it's truly difficult to break through once more by just relying on myself. So I want to join the Pale Sword sect, and I hope to learn new things in the Blue Sword sect so that I can break through once more in the Sword Dao. The middle-aged man looked at Yi Xian for a long time before he said, "You can become an inner court disciple." Inner court disciple? Yi Xian shook his head. "I want to become an elite disciple." The middle-aged man smiled. "Why?" Yi Xian said, "Becoming an elite disciple allows one to learn more and obtain more resources." The middle-aged man shook his head lightly. "Your way of thinking is correct. However, if you want to become an elite disciple, then it depends on if any of the martial uncles are willing to accept you. If they aren't willing, then you can only become an inner court disciple. Understand?" Yi Xian hesitated for a moment, and then he said, "I'm so outstanding, so they ought to accept me, right?" The middle-aged man laughed heartily. "Your skin is really thick." Yi Xian said seriously, "I'm an honest person, and I like to speak the truth." The middle-aged man shook his head. "Come with me. Since you're already a sword master, then you're qualified to see the martial uncles." Finished speaking, he turned and left. Yi Xian was about to follow, but as if he thought of something, he suddenly flicked his finger, and a spatial ring fell in front of the old man. "Just now, I've offended you." Finished speaking, he hurriedly followed the middle-aged man. Behind him, the old man glanced at the spatial ring and was instantly stunned. Inside the spatial ring, there were actually millions of top-grade spirit stones. Millions of top-grade spirit stones. To him, this was undoubtedly not a small amount of wealth. A moment later, the old man put away the spatial ring and said with a smile, "Interesting little fellow." Under the middle-aged man's lead, Yi Xian arrived at the top of the mountain. There was only a single palace at the top of the mountain, and he didn't see anyone along the way, not even a single Pale Sword sect disciple. As if he knew what Yi Xian was thinking, the middle-aged man suddenly smiled. "They're all cultivating in the Mausoleum of Swords, so it's very rare to see them." Yi Xian nodded, and then he asked, "How many swordsmen are there in the Pale Sword sect?" The middle-aged man smiled. "About 150, but there are 6 sword immortals, 26 sword emperors, 62 sword masters, and the rest are at least great swordsmen. Of course, only some who have just joined aren't. However, anyone who's able to join the Pale Sword sect has great talent and potential, so becoming a great swordsman and swordmaster is only a matter of time." Yi Xian's scalp went numb when he heard that. 6 sword immortals, 26 sword emperors, 62 sword masters. What a fucking terrifying lineup. As expected of one of the top powers in the Central Divine Continent. The Realm Defense Alliance. At that moment, Yi Xian suddenly thought of the Realm Defense Alliance. If the Pale Sword sect was this terrifying, then just how terrifying was the Realm Defense Alliance's true strength? At that moment, the two of them entered the main hall. The main hall was empty. On each side of the main hall, there were 3 empty chairs. The middle-aged man bowed slightly to the center of the main hall. "Martial uncles, please come out and meet me. There's a young man who wants to become a true disciple." After a moment of silence, an old man with white hair and a beard suddenly appeared on the first seat on the left. The old man sized up Yi Xian, then shook his head. "Too bad." After saying that, he immediately disappeared. Yi Xian. At that moment, a white-robed middle-aged man suddenly appeared on the first seat on the right. The middle-aged man glanced at Yi Xian, then disappeared without saying a word. Just like that, after a while, only the last seat on the left remained empty, and the people who had appeared before all shook their heads. To put it simply, they didn't like him. Yi Xian's face was as gloomy as water. He had underestimated the Pale Sword sect. The Pale Sword sect didn't like ordinary sword masters at all. Moreover, they were only at the Divine Unity realm. The problem was that he couldn't return to the Myriad Dharma realm or Sword Emperor, because if he did that, it would definitely arouse suspicion. At that moment, a woman suddenly appeared on the last seat. The woman glanced at Yi Xian, her face expressionless. "A bit too bad, but barely. My Cloud's Word Mountain just so happens to be lacking an errand boy. Come with me." Errand boy. Yi Xian. Chapter 276. After saying that, the woman turned around and disappeared. Yi Xian was dumbfounded. Doing odd jobs? Asking a dignified sword emperor to do odd jobs? That was too much. At this moment, the middle-aged man in front of Yi Xian suddenly said, "And Yi, Are you willing to go to Cloud's Word Peak? Yi Xian was slightly hesitant. He came here to study. To do odd jobs. Study my ass. As if he knew what Yi Xian was thinking, the middle-aged man said with a smile. Actually, even though you'll be doing odd jobs at Cloud's Word Peak in name, if you're willing, you can still learn many things on the mountain. If you're unwilling, you can only start as an inner court disciple. If you show outstanding performance in the future, you'll have a chance to become an elite disciple. Yi Xian thought about it and said, I'll go. Starting as an inner court disciple was too slow. But that woman was a sword immortal. Staying by the side of such a person would definitely allow him to learn many things. The middle-aged man nodded slightly. Then report to Cloud's Word Peak. Remember, senior sister Yuqi's character is a bit strange. Actually, she's not very strange. She's a pretty good person. Quickly report to Cloud's Word Peak. After saying that, he turned around and disappeared. On the spot, Yi Xian's face was filled with black lines. Needless to say, there was probably something strange about this Cloud's Word Peak. After hesitating for a moment, he finally decided to go to Cloud's Word Peak because he couldn't leave now since he was already here. Before coming here, Yi Xian had already investigated Pale Sword Sect. Pale Sword Sect had 7 main peaks, namely Pale Sword Peak, Mysterious Sword Peak, Cloud's Word Peak, 100 Herb Peak, Imperial Brush Peak, Formation Peak, and Weapon Forging Peak. Previously, he wasn't familiar with these 7 peak masters, but after seeing 6 of them just now, he realized that every peak master was a sword immortal. Pale Mountain's 7 sword immortals. The strength of Pale Sword Sect was much stronger than he'd imagined. Without thinking too much, Yi Xian turned around and left the main hall for Cloud's Word Peak. Every peak had a teleportation platform. The peak that Yi Xian was on also had one. He found the teleportation platform and used the teleportation formation to arrive at the Cloud Sword Peak. After arriving at the Cloud's Word Peak, he finally understood why it was called the Cloud's Word Peak. That was because the entire mountain was extremely tall, and the peak was surrounded by clouds and mist, making it look like a paradise. The scenery was great. Yi Xian's mood was no longer that gloomy. He continued forward, and before long, he arrived in front of a magnificent palace. He stood at the entrance of the palace and bowed slightly. Master Yu, Junior and Yi is here to report. There was no response from within the hall. Yi Xian called again, but there was still no response. There should be no one here. Yi Xian pushed open the door to the main hall. The moment he pushed open the door, Yi Xian was stunned. The hall in front of him was filled with all kinds of bamboo scrolls. Apart from the bamboo scrolls, there were also countless messy strips of cloth. These strips of cloth were all written with words. Upon closer inspection, Yi Xian discovered that these strips of cloth were written with some insights. Some insights on sword skills and swordsmanship. Yi Xian casually picked up a strip of cloth beside him. On it was written, "This sword skill is really bad. It takes too long to charge. If the enemy is fast enough, before the sword skill is unleashed, the enemy would already be dead. I should focus on revising a few parts." Next to the white cloth, there was a scroll. This scroll turned out to be an upper earth rank sword skill. 4 Seasons Sword Technique. Yi Xian opened the scroll and glanced at it. Gradually, Yi Xian's expression turned solemn, because he discovered that if he were to revise it according to Yuqi's annotations, the 4 Seasons Sword Technique would instantly undergo a qualitative transformation. It could be said that after the revision, the 4 Seasons Sword Technique could at least reach the pseudo-heaven rank. What a monster! At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. Because before this, apart from the mysterious woman, he had not seen any other powerful swordsman. Before this, he had looked down on the Firmament World swordsman. This chapter is not finished. Please continue to the next page. Cultivation, or rather, he himself was a little arrogant. He was arrogant enough to think that he was the best in the Firmament World. At this moment, he finally understood what it meant by there would always be someone better than you. People should always maintain a humble heart, because there will always be people who are more powerful than you. Learn from others' strengths. Only by constantly learning could one improve continuously. There were many cabinets around the hall. Obviously, these cabinets were used to store these scrolls. Yi Xian began to organize them. In the process, he would carefully look at the insights and sword skills that Yuqi had left behind, as well as some swordsmanship cultivation methods. However, he only looked at them and did not learn them, because these sword skills were not as good as his one sword determines life and death, one sword determines soul, and his self-created Tenjong kill. Even so, he still carefully looked at them and studied them. He learned the ability to find flaws in sword skills. Not only that, through continuous study and research, he found many flaws in sword skills. In the future, if someone used these sword skills against him, he could easily break them. However, this work was very troublesome, because many of the scrolls were not in the same place as Xueqi's insights and comments. He needed to slowly find them, and only after he found them, could he put them in the same box. Although it was troublesome, Yi Xian enjoyed it, because he could learn a lot. Time passed bit by bit, until the next night. Yi Xian was still organizing, and he had already organized at least 1/5 of the hall. It was too messy, too messy. Sometimes, Yi Xian was speechless. When Xueqi was studying these things, he must have randomly thrown them away, or else it would not be so messy. During this time, Xueqi did not come back, and no one knew where he went. The next morning, Yi Xian was really tired. So, he laid on the ground and started to rest. At this moment, the door of the hall suddenly opened, and a woman walked in. The woman wore a long black dress, and on the long dress, there were several white jade flowers. From the appearance, she was about 20 years old, with delicate facial features, and long hair that flowed over her shoulders. There were some white strands in her long hair. On her feet, she wore a pair of straw sandals, which was very simple. The person who came was the peak master of the cloud's word peak, Xueqi. When she saw Yi Xian sleeping, Xueqi immediately frowned. However, when she saw the books on the cabinets around her, she was slightly taken aback. Then, she glanced at the surroundings. Although the surroundings still looked a little messy, it was much better than before. Moreover, there was an extra path in the middle. Xueqi pondered for a moment, then looked at Yi Xian. She did not speak, and with a point of her finger, a storage ring fell in front of Yi Xian. Then she walked towards the depths of the hall, and in the hall, there was a cabinet where she rested. At noon, Yi Xian woke up. He looked at the storage ring in front of him, and there were 100,000 top-grade spiritual stones in the ring. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. It was undoubtedly very, very little for him, but for an ordinary disciple, it was actually quite a lot. Without thinking too much, Yi Xian put away the storage ring and continued to organize. Through organizing and studying, he gradually learned some principles and experience, the principles of finding flaws, and the experience of how to modify sword skills. At this moment, he suddenly realized that the Tenjong kill that he had created was somewhat inadequate. However, he did not feel the same way about the single sword strike to determine life and death and single sword strike to determine soul. These two sword skills could not be considered as sword skills, but a kind of sword belief. When he realized that the Tenjong kill had some shortcomings, Yi Xian was a little overjoyed because discovering his own shortcomings was equivalent to improving himself. People were not afraid of having shortcomings, but they were afraid of not knowing their own shortcomings. 2 days later. This chapter is not finished. Please continue to the next page. When he was organizing a scroll, Yi Xian was suddenly stunned. Heaven rank sword skill. During this period of time, he'd organized the heaven rank sword techniques. However, this heaven rank sword technique was slightly different. Because it was a heaven rank sword technique related to space, void flash. If this sword technique was cultivated to the extreme, it could make use of space to make one sword chi appear in front of the enemy in an instant, achieving an unexpected effect. In order to learn this sword technique, one must have reached the pinnacle of the use of space. At the very least, one must have reached the 10,000 Dharma realm. On the other hand, Yi Xian obviously fulfilled these conditions. Moreover, he possessed the spatial Tao law, and the might of this sword technique would definitely multiply with the spatial Tao law. He could learn. Yi Xian was overjoyed. As if he had thought of something, he hurriedly looked for Xueqi's annotation. It took him almost an hour to find it. On the white cloth. Creativity is okay, but the consumption is huge. If you manage to cultivate this sword skill, remember not to forcefully use your sword chi to pierce through space when you use it. You should use space as a support and let the power of space form a pushing force. This way, the sword speed of this sword skill can be multiplied. This sword skill consumes a huge amount of energy, but you can adjust the meridians that circulate. After a short while, Yi Xian put away the white cloth and sighed softly. I'm convinced. He was convinced. He truly admired Yu Qi because Yu Qi's annotation could be said to have improved this sword skill by at least a level. Cultivate. Yi Xian decisively chose to cultivate. After tidying up the surroundings, he left the main hall and went to the depths of the back mountain. There was a bamboo forest in the depths of the back mountain, and Yi Xian sat down cross-legged after entering the depths of the bamboo forest. He started to recall the instant space sword. The most difficult part of the instant space sword was that it required a very deep understanding of space, and he just happened to meet that requirement. Moreover, he had the Space Dao Law. With the Space Dao Law, it would be even easier for him to cultivate. Just like that, 4 hours later, Yi Xian, who was sitting cross-legged on the ground, suddenly stood up. The sword in his hand suddenly disappeared. 100 feet away, a wisp of sword light suddenly flashed out of a space, and then a sword tip appeared in that space. There was only the tip of the sword, not the blade. Yi Xian felt slightly embarrassed. Obviously, he had failed. Yi Xian didn't give up, and he continued trying over and over again. At noon the next day, the sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly vanished, and in the next moment, the bamboo forest around him was suddenly slashed apart. The void flash. At this moment, a voice suddenly resounded from the side. Yi Xian cursed inwardly. The owner of this voice was Yu Qi. Yi Xian turned around and saw Yu Qi standing not too far away from him. Yu Qi just stared at him, and it caused Yi Xian's scalp to go numb. Suddenly he had an idea and hurriedly said, Master Yu, no matter how I cultivated earlier, I couldn't get it right. In the end, after reading your annotation, I cultivated according to the method you said. I never expected that I would actually succeed. Yu Qi was slightly stunned. My annotation? Yi Xian nodded quickly, and then he took out a piece of white cloth and handed it to Yu Qi. This is it. Yu Qi glanced at the white cloth, and after a moment, she nodded slightly. It was my annotation, but... Speaking of this, she looked at Yi Xian. This sword skill can only be practiced by a true 10,000 Dharma realm expert, and you seem to be only at the Divine Unity realm. Yi Xian's expression froze. How to fool. This is a problem. P.S. Let me remind everyone, there have been a lot of scammers recently, the kind of people who say that they have finished the book and that they can read it by spending money. Some readers have been fooled. Everyone must be careful. And that reader found me through my QQ, and even sent me a screenshot of the transfer. I have already transferred the money to him, mainly because I was touched. If I didn't really like it, I wouldn't have been fooled. Everyone must be careful. End of this chapter. Chapter 277. Yu Qi looked at Yi Xian with a calm expression, but Yi Xian felt an invisible pressure. Sword immortal. This is a sword immortal. Yi Xian pondered for a moment, then said, Actually, I am at the true 10,000 Dharma realm. As he spoke, he released his true 10,000 Dharma realm aura. Yu Qi sized up Yi Xian. Since you are at the true 10,000 Dharma realm, why do you hide your aura? Yi Xian smiled bitterly. I want to keep a low profile. Yu Qi shook her head. No, when you came to my blue sword sect, you didn't keep a low profile. Moreover, you wanted to become a true disciple the moment you arrived. This proves that you don't want to keep a low profile at all. Yi Xian smiled bitterly. This wasn't easy to fool. Yu Qi suddenly said, It's fine if you don't want to say it, stay here and don't leave. Later, the sect's enforcers will come to find you. You can go talk to them. As she finished speaking, she turned and left. At this time, Yi Xian hurriedly ran in front of Yu Qi, smiling bitterly. Master Yu, I hid my realm because I had my own difficulties. It's not that I have evil intentions towards the Blue Sword sect. Moreover, with my ability, it's impossible for me to pose any threat to the Blue Sword sect. What do you think? Yu Qi glanced at Yi Xian. What difficulties? Yi Xian hesitated, then said, I'm being chased. Yu Qi looked straight at Yi Xian. Why are you being chased? Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Master Yu, is this important? Of course. Yu Qi said, if you do something devoid of conscience and are being chased, then you deserve to die. But if you are being chased because you were bullied or because you met with injustice, then it's a different matter. Yi Xian hurriedly said, Of course it's the latter. Yu Qi asked again, Who is chasing you? Yi Xian said, True 10,000 Dharma realm, and experts above that.
Xueqi frowned. Then why aren't you dead?
Yi Xian was speechless.
Xueqi sized up Yi Xian and said, if what you said is true, then you should have died at least 100 times with your strength.
Yi Xian laughed. Maybe I'm lucky. Xueqi shook his head. Forget it. Everyone has their own secrets.
Since you didn't do something that goes against the heavens and is being hunted down by others, and you're a disciple of my blue sword sect, then do your job well here.
With that, she turned around and left.
At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly said, Master Yu. Xueqi halted his steps. Yi Xian walked over to Xueqi, hesitated for a moment, and then said, actually, my real name is Yi Xian. When he said these words, even he himself was stunned, because he didn't expect it.
Yi Xian? Xueqi nodded slightly.
Understood.
With that, she continued forward.
On the spot, Yi Xian was stunned, and then he hurriedly ran over to Xueqi. He pointed to himself. I am Yi Xian.
Xueqi frowned slightly. I already know that your real name is Yi Xian. Is there a problem?
Yi Xian's throat rolled and then he said, Master Yu, you've never heard of me.
Xueqi's frown deepened. Are you very famous? Yi Xian was speechless.
Xueqi ignored him and walked straight into the distance, disappearing into the bamboo forest in a short while.
On the spot, Yi Xian was stunned for a long time. In the end, he shook his head and smiled.
I was very honest. He finally knew why he'd confessed his true identity at the last moment. Conscience. Most of the time people could be shameless, but most of the time people couldn't be shameless.
Shameless.
This chapter isn't finished. Please continue.
He had to be right. Without thinking too much about it, Yi Xian continued to cultivate Void Flash.
Because of the Space Dao law, his cultivation was getting smoother and smoother. If the instant space sword was paired with his chaotic chi, it would definitely be very, very terrifying when used for assassination. Now, he kind of wanted to assassinate an expert at the true defensive Dharma realm.
Arrogance.
At the thought of this, Yi Xian couldn't help but chuckle because he felt that he had indeed become a little arrogant.
However, he liked this feeling. This kind of confidence.
After the sky turned dark, Yi Xian returned to the hall, and he walked to the front of the inner hall.
Master Yu, do you want to eat?
No.
This was Xueqi's answer.
Yi Xian nodded, and then he walked over to the side and took out a table. On the table was a table filled with dishes that he'd made with local ingredients in the dense forest.
Fragrant. It wasn't ordinary fragrant.
Right when Yi Xian was about to move his chopsticks, Xueqi suddenly walked over. She glanced at the dishes on the table before looking at Yi Xian in the end, and she seemed to be waiting for something.
How could Yi Xian not understand?
He hurriedly stood up and passed the chopsticks to Xueqi, and then he smiled.
Master Yu, try this.
Xueqi nodded, took the chopsticks, and then sat before the table. She glanced at the dishes on the table before she picked up a mushroom and placed it in her mouth. After a short moment, she blinked and nodded.
Not bad.
As soon as she finished speaking, she picked up a few more. Yi Xian was delighted when he saw this. Because forming a good relationship with Xueqi would definitely be boundlessly beneficial to him. Meanwhile, Xueqi suddenly looked at him. You eat as well. Yi Xian chuckled, and then he withdrew a pair of chopsticks and started eating. Just like that, the two of them ate one after another, and it wasn't long before all the dishes on the table had been swept clean.
Obviously, Xueqi hadn't eaten such delicious food for a long time.
Xueqi put down her chopsticks and stood up. As if she had thought of something, she glanced at Yi Xian. You'll be the one to cook from now on. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and walked into the inner hall.
Yi Xian was speechless.
After tidying up, Yi Xian continued to organize the sword skills and cultivation techniques in the inner hall. Although he had only been in the Tsang sword sect for a short time, Yi Xian had gained too much during this time. This also made him understand that cultivation couldn't be done behind closed doors. He had to constantly learn and learn from the strengths of others. Only in this way would he be able to improve himself. Besides tidying up the inner hall every day, he still had to do one more thing, and that was cook. Xueqi was full of praise for his cooking every single time. In this regard, Yi Xian came to a conclusion that if he wanted to capture a woman's heart, he had to first capture her stomach. And Yi Xian's hard work was also fruitful, and that was to receive pointers from Xueqi from time to time. It had to be said that Xueqi's pointers really hit the nail on the head. Just like that, about half a month later, an old man suddenly came to the cloudy sword peak. Outside the inner hole, the old man bowed slightly. Uncle Master Yu, under the orders of the sect master, has come to summon Uncle Master's true disciples to wait at the inherited sword platform. After a moment of silence, a voice came from the inner hall. Got it. The old man bowed again, then turned around and left. Inside the inner hall, Xueqi walked out and glanced at Yixian, who was tidying up. There should be a mission for you to do at the inherited sword platform. As she spoke, she waved her hand and an upper-grade truth-grade sword fell in front of Yixian. I'll lend it to you for now. As she finished speaking, she turned around and entered the inner hall. Mission. This chapter is not finished. Please continue to the next page. Yixian was stunned. There was a mission to do? After a moment, he felt a little relieved. In the sect, under normal circumstances, there were some missions for the disciples to do. The purpose of doing so was naturally to train one's survival ability and combat ability. If one kept practicing in the sect without any contact with the outside world, he would undoubtedly become a fool. After a moment, Yixian put away the sword in front of him and went to the inherited sword platform. The inherited sword platform was located on a lone mountain. The mountain was very high, only second to the cloudy sword peak. At the top of the mountain, there was a huge stone platform. On the stone platform, there was a huge sword. The huge sword was more than 10 feet tall and 300 feet wide. It stood straight, as if it was going to pierce through the sky. When Yixian arrived at the inherited sword platform, there were already two people there, a man and a woman. Both of them were not very old, in their 20s. The man wore a blue robe, while the woman wore a water-green dress. Both of them carried a sword case on their backs. Seeing Yixian, the two of them cupped their fists at Yixian as a greeting. Yixian hurriedly returned the greeting. The three of them waited quietly at the side. No one said a word. Yixian, however, felt a little bored. He walked to the man's side. How should I address you, brother? The man glanced at Yixian, then said, Shenzhen Peak, by Li Yun. Yixian's expression was very shocked. So you are by Li Yun from the Pale Sword sect. Bai Li Yun was stunned, then said, You have heard of me? Yixian said seriously, Of course. To be honest, I have just entered the Pale Sword sect. Before coming to the Pale Sword sect, I have already heard of you, brother Bai Li Yun. Who in the outside world does not know you, Bai Li Yun? Bai Li Yun blinked his eyes. I am very famous? Yixian's expression was incomparably serious. Very famous. Who does not know that brother Bai Li Yun is the future hope of our Pale Sword sect? Bai Li Yun hurriedly said. This? Although there is a little bit of truth, I, a person who cultivates the sword, should always maintain a low profile and humble heart. Yixian, at this time Bai Li Yun approached Yixian, and said, And about that, what else did the outside world say about me? Yixian was about to speak at this time, there was suddenly a sword cry in the distant sky. And then, a woman suddenly flew over from the distant sky on a sword. The sword flew across the sky. The woman rode on the sword with an extremely graceful posture and steadily landed beside the inherited sword platform. After landing, the woman jumped off the sword, and with a hook of her jade-like fingers, the green sword directly transformed into a ray of sword light and entered between her eyebrows. The woman was extremely beautiful, especially her figure. It was extremely graceful and slender, causing people to be unable to help but want to hug her. It's senior sister Lan Yu. By Yixian's side, Bai Li Yun said, Senior sister Lan Yu is extremely formidable. Supposedly, she'll be able to attain the Sword Emperor realm in a year at most. Yixian hurriedly asked, Brother Bai Li Yun, who's more formidable between you and her? Bai Li Yun hesitated for a moment, and then he said, If she doesn't use a sword, then it's a 50-50 battle between us. Yixian couldn't help but fiercely despise this fellow in his heart. He's actually shameless to such an extent. Meanwhile, an old man suddenly appeared on the inherited sword platform, and he glanced at Yixian's group of 4. After all of you leave this place, you must listen to senior sister Lan Yu's orders and cooperate well with her to complete this assignment. You'll be richly rewarded if the assignment is completed, and you'll definitely be punished if you fail. Now let's go. As soon as the old man finished speaking, Lan Yu directly flew up into the sky on her sword. On the other hand, the woman by Yi Xian's side followed closely behind her, and so did Bai Liyun. The three of them quickly vanished into the clouds. On the other hand, there was no movement from Yi Xian. The old man gazed at Yi Xian. Do you have a problem? Yi Xian's face darkened. I have a huge fucking problem. I don't fucking know how to control a sword. End of this chapter. Chapter 278. Sword Control. A dignified sword emperor actually doesn't know how to control a sword. Even Yi Xian himself felt that it was quite shameful. The greatest humiliation of his life. The old man frowned slightly when he saw Yi Xian remain silent. Why aren't you answering? Yi Xian smiled. Elder, I don't know how to control a sword. The old man was slightly stunned. You don't know how to control a sword? Yi Xian nodded. The old man frowned. Are you joking? Yi Xian hurriedly said, I've only entered the sword sect for less than half a month, and my master hasn't taught me how to control a sword. Martial uncle you. The old man fell silent for a moment before he spoke softly. Martial uncle you? When he spoke up to this point, he glanced at Yi Xian. You don't know how to control a sword. That's a problem. Right at this moment, a ray of light shot down from the sky, and it landed on the ground. It was Bai Liyun. Bai Liyun walked over to Yi Xian and was slightly puzzled. Brother Yi, why didn't you come with me? Yi Xian was speechless. The old man spoke abruptly. He hasn't learned how to control a sword. Bai Liyun was stunned, and then he looked at Yi Xian and smiled. It's fine, it's fine. It isn't difficult to control a sword. It wouldn't be too late for Brother Yi to learn it in the future. As for now, if Brother Yi doesn't mind, you can control a sword with me. Yi Xian nodded. Then I'll trouble Brother Bailey to give me a ride. Bai Liyun roared with laughter. Don't mention it. As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his right hand, and a sword hovered in midair. He leaped up and descended firmly onto the blade of the sword, and then he looked at Yi Xian. Yi Xian leaped up as well and descended behind Bai Liyun. In next to no time, his sword shot into the sky and into the clouds. His heartbeat sped up. At this moment, Yi Xian felt his heartbeat speed up, and even his breathing quickened. It didn't take long for the sword to charge into the sky. At this moment, the entire firmament sword sect below seemed tiny. Not long after, the two of them caught up to Lan Yu. Lan Yu stopped in the air, she glanced at Yi Xian and Bai Liyun. Follow. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and transformed into a ray of sword light that vanished into the horizon. His speed was extremely fast. On the other hand, the other woman seemed to be slightly unconvinced. She immediately sped up and instantly disappeared into the horizon. In front of Yi Xian, Bai Liyun exclaimed in admiration. This senior sister Lan Yu is amazing. Her sword maneuvering speed far surpasses ours. But it can't be helped. The sword in senior sister Lan Yu's hand is at the peak of the true rank, and it can be considered a half-step heavenly rank sword. Yi Xian asked, is this speed related to the sword? Bai Liyun nodded. Of course. The quality of the sword determines how much power it can withstand. If the sword isn't good enough, then the sword maneuvering speed will drop greatly. Besides that, the speed of the sword maneuvering speed is also related to the person's strength. Your master will tell you all of this in the future. Yi Xian nodded. Needless to say, after coming out this time, he'd learned too many things. The mysterious woman's sword Dao was too high-end. It was so high that it wasn't suitable for him now. What he had to do now was not to bite off more than he could chew. His path had to be walked step by step. Roughly an hour later, the four of them arrived in the sky above a small island. Under Lan Yu's lead, the four of them descended at the edge of the island. After they landed, Lan Yu glanced at Yi Xian's group of three. This island is called Myriad Island, and it's a product of our firmament sword sect. There are abundant spirit ores and treasures of heaven and earth on and around this island. However, just a day ago, all the people that were guarding this place suddenly disappeared. This time, the objective of our trip here is to investigate this matter clearly. Yi Xian suddenly asked, what realm are the people guarding this place at? This chapter is not finished, please continue to the next page. Lan Yu glanced at Yi Xian. There are 3 at the Law Defending Realm and 6 at the Law Defending Realm. Hearing this, Yi Xian suddenly frowned. If the other party can make these 9 people disappear without a trace, this proves that the other party is most likely at the true Law Defending Realm, or that they have a large number of people. I think that with just the 4 of us, we should leave immediately and start somewhere else instead of coming to this island so recklessly. Hearing this, Lan Yu frowned. What, are you afraid? Yi Xian was somewhat speechless. Senior Sister Lan, this isn't fear, this is planning before taking action. As he said that, he looked around. Haven't you guys noticed? After we entered this island, there was no movement at all. Apart from that, the surrounding water is also extremely calm. There's clearly wind, but it's so calm. Lan Yu suddenly walked in front of Yi Xian. If you're afraid, then leave. Yi Xian almost slapped this woman away. Was there something wrong with her head? At this moment, Bailey Yun suddenly came out to be a peacemaker. Senior Sister Lan Yu, Brother Yi, we're all on the same side, let's not harm each other. Moreover, we're all here for the same mission, and that is to clearly investigate who exactly is it that is secretly making a move against our Blue Sword sect. What do all of you think? Lan Yu coldly looked at Yi Xian. Do you think that I don't know what you're talking about? However, we swordsmen should move forward bravely, face everything directly, and not run away. Only by doing this, can our swords be successful. Yi Xian shook his head. Pedantic. Hearing Yi Xian's words, Lan Yu's expression instantly changed. She suddenly pulled out her sword and pointed it at Yi Xian. What did you say? Say it one more time. Yi Xian spoke indifferently. I said you're stupid. Presumptuous. Lan Yu charged forward swiftly with her sword in hand, and a wave of sword light slashed down diagonally, and it instantly arrived above Yi Xian's head. It was swift like a bolt of lightning. However, at the moment this sword descended, Yi Xian had already retreated over 30 m away. Her sword strike missed. Lan Yu was stunned, and then she sized up Yi Xian and sneered, You have some ability. As soon as she finished speaking, she was about to attack once more when Bailey Yun hurriedly stood in front of her. Senior Sister Lan Yu, don't be rash. If you injure one of our own because of some small matter, then you'll surely be expelled from the sect when we return. Expelled from the sect? Lan Yu frowned. Private battles were strictly prohibited in the Pale Sword sect. If there was really a conflict, then it could be mediated by the sect elders, and if it still didn't work, then they could apply for a life and death challenge. However, the Pale Sword sect hadn't had a life and death duel in almost 100 years. If a sect was at odds with each other, then it would be filled with a foul atmosphere. Thus, if anyone was unreasonable or intentionally caused trouble, then the Pale Sword sect would directly expel them from the sect. Lan Yu fell silent for a moment before she glanced coldly at Yi Xian, and then she sheathed her sword before turning around and walking towards the depths of the island. The other woman was called Gu Yu, and she glanced at Yi Xian before turning around and following her. Bailey Yun walked over to Yi Xian and patted Yi Xian on the shoulder. Brethren, this senior sister Lan Yu has a bad temper, so don't bother with her. Moreover, this senior sister Lan Yu is from the Shenzhen Peak, and the Shenzhen Peak isn't one to be trifled with. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. Actually, I'm not one to be trifled with, haha. Bailey Yun laughed. Brethren, if you're a difficult person to get along with, then you won't be able to get along with anyone during this period of time. Let's go, let's hurry up and catch up. No matter what kind of conflicts there are within the sect, if we don't help our enemies when we encounter them, then that's a huge taboo. With that, he pulled Yi Xian and ran towards the depths of the island. Along the way, Yi Xian's expression was rather solemn, because his intuition told him that this damned place was actually not simple. Not long later, the few of them arrived in front of a black palace. This chapter is not over, please turn the page. Lan Yu and the others instantly frowned. Yi Xian asked, What's wrong? Bailey Yun said in a deep voice. Before this, there was no palace here. To be precise, a day ago, there was no palace here. No palace. Yi Xian raised his head to look at the black palace. The palace's door was open, but he couldn't see inside. Let's go. Lan Yu was about to enter when Yi Xian shook his head. Don't go in there. Lan Yu flared up with rage when she heard Yi Xian, and she pointed angrily at Yi Xian. You coward. You. Right at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly waved his hand. All right. Just go in quickly. Lan Yu glanced coldly at Yi Xian, and her eyes didn't conceal the disdain in them at all. Ugly people always cause trouble and are cowardly. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and walked towards the Black Palace. This time, Gu Yu glanced at Yi Xian and didn't follow Lan Yu in. Bailey Yun hesitated for a moment and said, "Junior sister Gu Yu and brother N, should we follow them in?" Yi Xian was just about to speak when a huge explosion suddenly resounded from within the Black Palace, and then a beautiful figure flashed out from within it. It was Lan Yu. At this moment, her entire body was covered in injuries. Especially her left shoulder, it had split open, and her entire arm had almost fallen off. Moreover, a hideous rotting figure was following behind Lan Yu. The rotting figure was extremely swift, and its fist had arrived behind Lan Yu's head as soon as she left the palace. If that fist were to land on her head, then it would definitely shatter her into pieces. Lan Yu didn't dare to continue running, and she immediately turned around and slashed with her sword. Bang! An explosion resounded, and then Lan Yu was instantly blasted over 30 m away. However, she hadn't even stopped when the rotting figure charged towards her once more. Meanwhile, Gu Yu and Bailey Yun who stood by Yi Xian's side suddenly drew their swords, and 2 rays of light slashed towards the rotting figure. The rotting figure raised its hand and smashed its fist forward. Bang! The 2 rays of light instantly exploded apart. Right at this moment, the ground in the surroundings suddenly wriggled, and it didn't take long for almost 20 rotting figures to crawl out from the ground. Seeing this scene, the expressions of Lan Yu and the others instantly changed. Yi Xian's face was expressionless, and he was just about to make a move when Lan Yu suddenly crushed a sound-transmitting talisman. The sound-transmitting talisman exploded, and a message soared into the sky. However, there was no response at all. Seeing this, Lan Yu's expression instantly became unsightly. This was a sound-transmitting talisman for help. Before they came here, experts from Pale Sword Sect had been following them in secret. Just at this moment, a voice suddenly resounded from nearby. "Are you asking him for help?" Hearing this voice, Lan Yu and the others turned their heads and looked over. Not far away, a red-haired man was slowly walking over, and in the red-haired man's hand, there was a bloody head. This head belonged to the Blue Sword Sect's elder, who had instructed the 4 of them before they came over. This person was an expert at magic controlling realm. Seeing this head, the faces of Lan Yu and the others instantly turned snow white. The red-haired man grinned. "Let me introduce myself. I'm from Qingzhou, and my name is Yi Xian. I'm currently the Dean of Blue Waves Academy." Yi Xian. Hearing this, Yi Xian was stunned. What the fuck is this? P.S. I've been crazily stockpiling my manuscripts, and I'm striving for the 3rd chapter next week. Now I've been informed that I'll have to spend this year in the hospital. Because my condition is unstable, I'll have to stay in the hospital for observation. It's not that I don't want to write the 3rd chapter, but I wanted to write the book until the end of the year. Unfortunately, things didn't go as I wished. This year, something happened to my family, and it completely messed up my writing plan. I'm really sorry, my brothers. End of this chapter. Chapter 279. Yi Xian. Needless to say, Yi Xian was dumbfounded at this moment. If it was someone with the same name, then it wasn't impossible. However, this wasn't someone with the same name. Not only did the opposite party come from Qingzhou, he was also the Dean of Blue Waves Academy. This was him impersonating him. Yi Xian's expression was incomparably gloomy and cold. He had already smelled a conspiracy. Hearing the words of the red-haired man, Lan Yu's complexion changed greatly. She looked at the red-haired man in horror. You are that Yi Xian wanted by Realm Protection Alliance." The red-haired man grinned. His mouth was full of red teeth. He slowly walked towards Lan Yu. "What? Is there a problem?" Lan Yu stared at the red-haired man. "Yi Xian, my Blue Sword Sect doesn't have any grudges with you. Why do you want to make my Blue Sword Sect your enemy?" The red-haired man smiled evilly. "I don't like your Blue Sword Sect. Is that okay?" "Impudent," Lan Yu said angrily. "Yi Xian, you are too arrogant." The red-haired man waved his hand at Lan Yu and said with a smile, "I, Yi Xian, am arrogant. If you don't accept it, come and hit me." Lan Yu was about to speak when Yi Xian suddenly said, "Big sister, he said he is Yi Xian and you believe him. I also said I am his father. Do you believe me?
Lan Yu glared at Yi Xian. Just when she was about to speak, the red-haired man suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian like a ghost.
He looked at Yi Xian with a sinister smile.
You seem very arrogant. Yi Xian tidied up his clothes.
Then he sternly said, I am arrogant.
If you don't accept it, come and hit me.
The red-haired man grinned.
I hope your ability is as tough as your mouth.
After speaking, he was about to attack. But at this time Yi Xian suddenly said, Wait.
The red-haired man stopped. Do you have any last words?
Yi Xian said seriously, What if I really am your father? I say what if?
Everything is possible.
The man in red still had a smile on his face, but it was a very cold smile. You've successfully angered me, Right at this moment, a sword suddenly appeared in Yi Xian's hand.
In the next moment, he held the sword with both hands and slashed it down.
Boom! As the sword slashed down, the red-robed man in front of Yi Xian suddenly exploded into a mist of blood. On the other hand, Yi Xian's expression was slightly solemn because the man in red had already appeared 30 meters away. However, at this moment, the man in red's expression was slightly unsightly. Obviously, even though that strike from before hadn't killed him, it had still affected him to a certain extent. The red-clothed man glared at Yi Xian. You're playing dirty.
Yi Xian ignored the man in red.
He turned to Bailey Yun and the other two. The three of you go back and report. Bailey Yun immediately shook his head. No, how can I leave you here alone?
If you want to leave, then we'll leave together. Lan Yu suddenly said, Why are you still being pedantic at a time like this? It's more important to go back and report.
As soon as she finished speaking, she shot into the sky on her sword. Right at this moment, the red-clothed man in front of Yi Xian suddenly raised his hand and waved it, causing an arrow of blood to tear through the sky.
Lan Yu's expression changed drastically, and she immediately slashed down with her sword.
However, the arrow of blood pierced through her sword and stabbed her chest. Bang! In an instant, Lan Yu's body exploded apart, but her soul was fine.
At this moment, her soul was tightly enveloped by a ball of red light.
A trace of surprise flashed through the red-clothed man's eyes. The Soul Guard mirror is a precious treasure, yet it was actually given to a piece of trash like you.
What a waste!
Lan Yu paid no attention to the red-clothed man, and she just gazed resentfully at Yi Xian. Why didn't you stop him?
This chapter isn't finished. Please keep going.
Yi Xian was stunned, and then he said, Please, every debt has a debtor.
It was he who destroyed your body, so why are you blaming me?
Go look for him. Lan Yu stared fixedly at Yi Xian. I won't let you off. As soon as she finished speaking, she was escorted by the ray of red light, and she transformed into a ray of light that vanished into the boundless sky.
Yi Xian shook his head. I actually encountered such a weirdo. I'm really unlucky this year.
As he spoke, he gazed at Bailey Yun and Gu Yu. Quickly head back and leave this place to me. Both of you'll become burdens to me if you stay here. Bailey Yun and Gu Yu exchanged glances, and then Bailey Yun spoke in a low voice. Brethren, hold on for a while. We'll immediately return to the sect and get someone to rescue you. As soon as he finished speaking, both of them shot into the sky on their swords. The red-clothed man waved his hand again, and then two blood-red arrows shot into the sky and chased after Bailey Yun and Gu Yu. However, these two blood-red swords had only just flown out when they were slashed into pieces by two rays of sword light.
Bailey Yun and Gu Yu instantly heaved sighs of relief when they sensed this scene, and then they hurriedly sped up. It wasn't long before they vanished into the boundless sky.
The red-clothed man gazed at Yi Xian and smiled. I never expected that I would be so blind. Yi Xian turned to face the red-clothed man. You're not Yi Xian, so why are you pretending to be Yi Xian? The corners of the red-clothed man's mouth curled up slightly. How do you know that I'm not Yi Xian? Yi Xian spoke seriously. Yi Xian has a dignified appearance, is handsome, elegant, talented, and elegant.
Such a person only appears once in 1,000 years. How could he possibly be a repulsive person like you?
The red-clothed man was stunned. I've also seen Yi Xian's portrait. Honestly speaking, doesn't your conscience hurt by praising him like that? Yi Xian pointed his sword at the ground. I'm not going to bullshit with you. I'll ask you one last time. Why did you pretend to be such an outstanding person and commit such evil deeds? The red-clothed man smiled. I'm not going to tell you. Yi Xian nodded. Then I'll beat you to death.
As soon as he spoke, he stomped his right foot. Zhang kill. The red-clothed man's expression changed drastically as soon as the sword was unleashed. In the next moment, a cloud of blood mist suddenly condensed in front of him, and this cloud of blood mist forcefully blocked Yi Xian's fatal attack. However, this attack caused him to stumble backward.
Not only that, but the cloud of blood mist also turned illusory at a speed visible to the naked eye.
At that moment, Yi Xian suddenly opened his palm, and another heaven-level sword appeared in his hand. In the next moment, the sword suddenly disappeared. Instant space.
The instant the sword disappeared, the blood mist in front of the red-robed man exploded, and a sword was already pressed against the spot between his eyebrows.
However, it was blocked by a thin layer of blood armor. Heaven-level armor.
Even though it had been blocked, the powerful force contained in the sword had caused the blood armor to cave in deeply.
At the same time, the area between the red-clothed man's eyebrows had caved in as well. The red-clothed man frantically retreated in order to reduce the force contained in Yi Xian's sword.
However, that force was far too powerful. So powerful that he had no way of removing it.
At that moment, the red-clothed man suddenly roared in anger. He stomped his right foot on the ground, causing the entire ground to shake violently. Using the strength of the ground, he forcefully stopped his retreat. However, the blood armor between his eyebrows had already cracked into a spider web. Just as he stopped, Yi Xian suddenly appeared in front of him.
Upon seeing Yi Xian, the red-clothed man hurriedly said, "Brother, I am the young sect leader of the Corpse sect.
This time, I am here on behalf of the Realm Protection Alliance to frame Yi Xian. This chapter is not over, please continue to the next page. The Realm Protection Alliance has entrusted me." At that moment, Yi Xian's sword had already struck out. One strike to determine life and death. This strike directly pierced through the red-clothed man's blood sword and his brain. The red-clothed man's body stiffened as he glared at Yi Xian with hatred. I told you everything, but you still tried to kill me.
Yi Xian shook his head. You're already an adult.
Don't be so naive. If I don't kill you, should I leave you alive to harm me in the future?
As he spoke, he swung his sword and the red-clothed man's head flew into the air.
Just as the red-clothed man's head flew into the air, a blood-red mark suddenly flew into the space between Yi Xian's eyebrows. Yi Xian frowned. What's that? Very quickly, Yi Xian understood. This should be a type of mark.
It meant that he had killed the red-clothed man and the power behind the red-clothed man could use this mark to find him.
Yi Xian thought for a moment before he activated the World Prison Pagoda. Very quickly, the blood-red mark was forced out of his brain by the World Prison Pagoda.
Yi Xian waved his right hand and a ray of sword light enveloped the blood-red mark.
Yi Xian kept the mark. Suddenly, he seemed to have thought of something and chuckled.
As he looked around, the 20 over corpses did not move at all.
Obviously, after the red-clothed man's death, these corpses were now ownerless. Yi Xian hurriedly put away the storage ring of the man in red. He rummaged through it, and very soon, he was overjoyed.
This was because he found a cultivation technique called the decaying scripture in the storage ring, and within it, there was a way to control these zombies.
Big profit. Yi Xian chuckled. Each of these 22 corpses was at least at the Dharma realm. Moreover, their bodies were special and could not be damaged by ordinary spiritual weapons. If he could control these 20 corpses and continue to train them until they reached the Dharma controlling realm, they would become a great help to him. Sometimes, a fight depended on the number of people. In addition, this matter also served as a reminder to him. The Realm Protection Alliance had not forgotten him. The other party was still looking for him. Not only were they looking for him, but they were also looking for someone to impersonate him, ruin his reputation, and make him enemies everywhere. The Realm Protection Alliance. Yi Xian smiled coldly. The enmity between him and the Realm Protection Alliance could be said to be irreconcilable. But now there was still a big gap between his strength and the Realm Protection Alliances, so he could not use force for the time being. Without thinking too much, Yi Xian began to clean up the aftermath because the Pale Sword Sect's powerhouses might arrive soon.
With a wave of his right hand, the red-clothed man's corpse was divided into more than a dozen pieces, and then he pieced them together into two large characters, Yi Xian.
After doing all this, he quickly put away the surrounding corpses.
Then, he waited for the pale sword sex powerhouses to arrive. After almost a quarter of an hour, 2 sword lights suddenly appeared in the sky. Yi Xian's heart skipped a beat. They're here. Soon, an old man and a middle-aged man appeared in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian quickly saluted. Greetings, elders. The middle-aged man glanced at Yi Xian. Are they all dead? Yi Xian nodded. The old man asked. Did you do it? Yi Xian quickly shook his head. No, I didn't do it. It was Yi Xian. After saying that, he pointed to the 2 blood-red characters on the ground. Yi Xian. The middle-aged man and the old man looked at the ground. A moment later, the middle-aged man frowned. He looked at Yi Xian. It really wasn't you. Yi Xian solemnly said, I swear, it was really that Yi Xian who did it. If I speak half a word of lies, I may be struck by lightning. End of this chapter. Chapter 280. After they heard Yi Xian, the old man and middle-aged man glanced at each other. In the end, the middle-aged man asked, Why did Yi Xian appear here? Yi Xian shook his head. Elder, I don't know. However, according to my guess, it's very likely to be related to the red-clothed man pretending to be him. The middle-aged man intended to ask something else when the old man said abruptly, This red-clothed man was able to kill a true defense realm expert, so his strength is obviously extraordinary. On the other hand, you allowed Bailey Yun and the others to leave first and successfully stopped the red-clothed man. Do you have anything to say about this? Yi Xian laughed bitterly. Elder, I don't think there's much of a problem if it's just stopping him for a moment, right? The old man stared fixedly at Yi Xian. Then why didn't you stop the red-clothed man when your senior sister Lan Yu left? Why did you allow him to slash her body into pieces instead? Yi Xian's heart shook when he heard this. So that's the old man's true objective. Yi Xian smiled and said, Elder, you have to be honest when you speak. Logically speaking, Lan Yu is the senior sister, so she should have stayed behind to protect the 3 of us. However, not only did she not stay behind after she encountered danger, she actually chose to flee. When he spoke up to hear, he faced the middle-aged man and said, Elder, do you think senior sister Lan Yu's actions are justified? The middle-aged man hadn't spoken when the old man spoke abruptly. I didn't ask you anything else. I only asked you why you didn't stop the red-clothed man and allowed him to slash Lan Yu's body into pieces. Just answer this one point, understand? His voice was slightly cold. Yi Xian faced the old man and said with a smile, Elder, I'm very sad that senior sister Lan Yu's body was slashed into pieces as well. But the problem is, I wasn't the one who slashed her body into pieces. So why do you keep holding on to me? As he spoke, he pointed at the red-clothed man's corpse on the ground. Look for him, look for him. The old man stared fixedly at Yi Xian. You clearly could have stopped him. Yet you didn't. What you're doing is equivalent to harming a fellow disciple, and for harming a fellow disciple, you should be punished by 10,000 swords. Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned cold. First, she's stupid. Before coming to the island, I already warned her that this place is dangerous and that she needs to be careful. Unfortunately, she didn't listen. Second, when faced with danger, as the senior sister, not only did she not choose to take on the responsibility of protecting her fellow disciple, she chose to be the first to escape. This is unjust. Third, she couldn't even withstand a single attack from the man in red. This is weak. I'm very curious, what kind of master would raise such trash? Speaking up to this point, he pretended to be surprised. Could it be you, Elder? Impudent. The old man's expression instantly turned icy cold. At the same time, he waved his right hand, and a wave of sword energy smashed down towards Yi Xian. The sword stance of a sword immortal. This force swept down like a storm, and the ground where Yi Xian stood was directly cracked by this force. On the other hand, Yi Xian even bent his waist in an instant. Not only did he bend his waist, but he even bent his legs. But it wasn't long before he forcefully stood up again. A trace of surprise flashed in the eyes of the middle-aged man by the old man's side when he witnessed this scene. On the other hand, there was a trace of surprise in the old man's eyes as well. In the next moment, he raised his right hand and suddenly pressed it down, and the pressure from the force instantly rose explosively. Just at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly drew his sword and slashed. Bang! Along with an explosion, the force directly collapsed, and Yi Xian himself was blasted over 100 meters away. As soon as he stopped, a wisp of blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth. In midair, the old man glanced coldly at Yi Xian. "I've underestimated you. You despised an elder and spoke rudely. Today, I'll cripple you to serve as a warning to the entire sect." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly pointed with his finger, and a flying sword slashed down. The flying sword was extremely fast like a bolt of lightning. Below. This chapter isn't finished. Please continue to the next page. Xian's expression was rather ferocious, and profound qi surged within his body. He didn't dare hold back at all when facing a sword immortal, and a true Imperial Dharma realm expert at that. If he did, then only death would await him. Just as Yi Xian was about to attack, a beautiful figure suddenly appeared in front of him. It was Yu Qi. Yu Qi's face was expressionless. She pressed her jade-like fingers together and pointed forward lightly. With this point, a cloud-shaped sword qi suddenly shot out from the tip of her finger. Bang! In midair, the old man's sword was directly blasted away. The old man frowned slightly when he saw Yu Qi. "Junior sister Yu Yu." At this moment, Yu Qi suddenly took a step forward and formed a sword seal. In the next moment, the clouds in the sky suddenly trembled, and in the blink of an eye, a sword came straight down from the clouds like a bolt of lightning. Seeing this scene, the old man's expression changed slightly. Sword in the cloud. Not daring to be careless, he opened his right hand and a sword quietly hung in the air. In the next moment, the sword turned into a sword light and soared into the sky. In midair, the two swords met. Bang! An ear-piercing sword cry suddenly resounded throughout the sky. Below, Yu Qi suddenly leaped, and the moment she leaped, several sword lights quietly gathered around her. Seeing this scene, the old man's eyes narrowed slightly, and there was a trace of fear in his eyes. Shadow sword. "Yu Qi, are you crazy, you?" He didn't dare to continue because Yu Qi had already arrived in front of him. Boom boom boom. In midair, the old man repeatedly struck with his sword, but he was also repeatedly retreating. The entire sky was filled with countless sword qi. Not far away, the middle-aged man hurriedly said, "Senior brother Cong Xian, junior sister Yu Qi, please stop." However, Yu Qi did not stop. On the contrary, her attacks became even fiercer. On the other hand, Cong Xian was clearly inferior to Yu Qi, and was already retreating step by step. Below, Yi Xian was a little dazzled by the sight. A battle between sword immortals. He had seen the mysterious woman in action before, but her attacks were basically instant kills. There was not much to see at all. But now, the battle between the two sword immortals made him realize just how cool the sword skills of sword immortals were. They were not flashy without substance. At the very least, the sword skills of the two people before him were very practical. Especially Yu Qi's, who skillfully executed all kinds of sword skills, making it difficult for Cong Xian to parry. Just like that, after fighting for an unknown period of time, Cong Xian suddenly turned into a sword light and disappeared into the horizon. He ran away. In the air, Yu Qi stopped. With a turn of her body, she directly appeared in front of Yi Xian. Yu Qi glanced at Yi Xian. "Go back and cook." With that, she turned around and soared into the sky on her sword, disappearing into the horizon in the blink of an eye. Below, Yi Xian smiled bitterly. "I don't know how to use a sword." At this moment, the middle-aged man not far away suddenly walked in front of Yi Xian. Did Yi Xian say anything before he left? Yi Xian thought for a moment, then said, "He said that this matter is most likely the work of the Realm Defense Alliance." Realm Defense Alliance. The middle-aged man's brows deeply furrowed. Evidently, this faction was a headache even for the ancient sword sect. A moment later the middle-aged man said softly, "This matter is a little complicated, you must not leak it." With that, he turned around and disappeared into the horizon. On the spot, Yi Xian speechlessly asked the heavens, "I don't know how to use a sword." If the distance was short, he could naturally fly. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. It was the 10,000 Dharma stage, but if it was too far, flying in the air would tire him to death. But at this moment, he had no other choice. Originally, it would only take 4 hours to reach Azure Sword Sect, but he had spent more than 8 hours. As soon as he returned to Cloud's Word Peak, he was brought to Azure Sword Peak by Xueqi. Azure Sword Peak was the head of the 7 peaks, and could be considered the core of Azure Sword Sect. And the Peak Master of Azure Sword Peak was the Sect Master of Azure Sword Sect, Chen Beihan. When Yi Xian and Xueqi arrived at the Azure Sword Hall of the Azure Sword Peak, there were already a few people in the hall. Song Xian and the middle-aged man from before were present. Apart from them, Bailey Yun, Gu Yu, and Lan Yu, who was already in soul form, were also present. When she saw Yi Xian, Lan Yu's gaze immediately turned venomous. Beside her, Song Xian also shot a cold glance at Yi Xian. Beside Yi Xian, Xueqi suddenly said, "Don't be afraid, her master can't beat me." Yi Xian. Bailey Yun smiled at Yi Xian as a form of greeting. Gu Yu nodded in agreement. Yi Xian was about to speak when a middle-aged man suddenly walked over from afar. The middle-aged man wore a cloud-white robe with a jade-white lion tied to his waist, and he held a flute in his right hand. Chen Beihan, the sect master of Azure Sword Sect. Yi Xian's expression instantly turned solemn when he saw this person, because he discovered that this person's aura was actually on par with Supreme Lord Lu. This person was also one of the top experts in the Azure world. Chen Beihan walked to the seats at the top of the stairs and smiled. "Everyone sit." Everyone in the surroundings bowed successively, and even Xueqi bowed slightly. Everyone sat down, and Chen Beihan glanced at Yi Xian. "You're in Yi." Yi Xian nodded. "Yes." Chen Beihan glanced at Yi Xian and said with a smile, "You are a good candidate." As he spoke, he glanced at the crowd. "I already know the whole story." As a senior sister, Lan Yu was obstinate and self-opinionated. She was narrow-minded and did not think twice when faced with trouble. She only ended up like this. Lan Yu's expression immediately turned ugly, but she did not dare to refute and hurriedly knelt down. Disciple knows her mistake. Chen Beihan looked towards Song Xian. Teaching disciples is not just about teaching them how to cultivate, but also how to conduct themselves. If young people do not know how to conduct themselves, they will suffer at the very least, or lose their lives. Song Xian nodded. Junior brother understands and knows that Lan Yu was wrong. I have troubled senior brother to come out this time to ask senior brother to uphold justice. As he spoke, he looked towards Yi Xian. This person clearly had the ability to stop the man in red, but did not. Instead, he deliberately did nothing to save him. Such a person does not deserve to be a disciple of my Azure Sword Sect. Chen Beihan looked towards Yi Xian. You had the ability to stop him, but did not. Why? Yi Xian pondered for a moment before he said, I don't like the sight of her. Everyone else. P.S. Today at the hospital, a man was arguing with a doctor. The reason was that when he was examined, he was not present, so the doctor let the next doctor take over. Then, this man could not take it anymore and started scolding the female doctor in the hospital. He even said that she had accepted a red packet. The female doctor was so angry that she burst into tears. Many a time, people like to bully the weak and fear the strong. If they met someone more ruthless than them, they would be as humble as a son. It was the new year, and they hoped that the brothers would be amiable. They should not bully others for no reason, but if others bullied them, they should not be afraid. It was not embarrassing if they could not win, but if they did not fight, it was very embarrassing. End of this chapter. Chapter 281. Everyone was taken aback by Yi Xian's words. He didn't like her? Bailey Yun smiled bitterly. Brother-in was an honest person. He didn't even know how to lie at a time like this. On the other hand, Lan Yu's expression was somewhat savage as she glared at Yi Xian. Xueqi also couldn't help glancing at Yi Xian. Be more tactful. Yi Xian. Song Xian suddenly said, Senior brother, you also saw how arrogant and domineering this person is. If such a person stays in the sect, he will definitely cause discord within the sect in the future, and outside the sect, he will very likely cause a great disaster. Senior brother, please punish him severely. Chen Beihan smiled. Don't worry, junior brother, everything has a reason. As he spoke, he looked at Yi Xian. Tell me, why do you dislike her? Yi Xian shook his head. Even if I tell you, the sect master and some people may not believe me. Let senior brother Bailey and senior sister Gu Yu tell me. Chen Beihan looked at Bailey Yun and Yu Qi. The two hurriedly bowed and recounted everything that had happened on the island. Gradually, Song Xian's expression turned rather ugly. He glared at Lan Yu. What a disappointment! Lan Yu lowered her head, not daring to speak. Yu Qi suddenly said, "The matter is very clear. He didn't deliberately cause trouble, and the troublemaker has already paid the price. My Cloud's Word Peak will not pursue the matter. Senior brother sect master, I still have matters to attend to, so I will take my leave first." After speaking, she glanced at Yi Xian. "Go cook." Yi Xian chuckled, turned around, and ran off. Yu Qi shook his head. Slippery fellow. After speaking, she also turned to leave. At this moment, Chen Beihan suddenly said, "Junior sister, there are important matters to discuss." Outside the door, Yu Qi did not even turn his head. "You decide." Inside the hall, Chen Beihan shook his head with a bitter smile. "This junior sister," as he spoke, he looked at Song Xian not far away. At the end of the day, the corpse sect is the culprit. As for the corpse sect, although they belong to the demonic path, they have always acted in the dark. This time, they openly attacked our pale sword sect, so there must be someone behind them. Song Xian was about to say something when he seemed to have thought of something. He glanced at Bailey Yun and the others. Song Xian, Gu Yu, and Lan Yu hurriedly left. After the trio left, Song Xian asked in a low voice, "Realm Defense Alliance?" Chen Beihan nodded. "There should be no mistake." Song Xian frowned. "Why are they against us too? To my blue sword sect has no enmity with them." Chen Beihan smiled and said, "Who said there's no enmity between us?" Song Xian shook his head. "If they wanted revenge, they wouldn't have waited until now." Chen Beihan nodded. He definitely wouldn't have waited until now. At this point, he exchanged a look with Song Xian before he continued, "There's something wrong with the island. Let's go check it out." With that, the two of them disappeared. Before long, the two of them arrived at Myriad Island. However, at this moment, the entire island had vanished. Seeing this scene, the two's expressions became a little grave. A short while later, Chen Beihan said, "Some powers in the Central Divine Prefecture have been secretly targeting the Realm Defense Alliance. Obviously, the Realm Defense Alliance has definitely done something to make those powers fear it. Especially Yi Xian and the powers standing behind him. His appearance on the island this time might be to disrupt the Realm Protection Alliance's plans. Pass down my order to find Yi Xian. We must get to the bottom of this matter." Song Xian nodded. "I understand. I'll send someone to search for Yi now. Xian." With that, he turned around and disappeared into the horizon. In the air, Chen Beihan slowly closed his eyes. Realm Defense Alliance. I'm afraid that the changes in the Azure world have something to do with you guys. The Azure Sword Sect. After returning to Cloud Sword Peak, Yi Xian immediately began cooking. Half an hour later, he had already prepared a table full of dishes. The dishes looked and smelled delicious. Yu Qi came out when she smelled the aroma. She sat opposite Yi Xian and nodded. "Let's eat." Yi Xian hurriedly said, "Master, please." Yu Qi didn't stand on ceremony and immediately started eating. After eating half, Yi Xian suddenly said, "Master, is the sword manipulation technique difficult?" Yu Qi said, "Difficult but not difficult." Yi Xian hurriedly put down his chopsticks. "What do you mean?" Yu Qi glanced at him. "It's not difficult to learn, but it's very difficult to learn it well." Yi Xian asked again, "How can I be considered to have learned it well?" Yu Qi took a small sip of vegetable soup and then said, "You can fight while controlling the sword." Yi Xian was taken aback. "Then Bailey Yun and the others can't fight while controlling the sword?" Yu Qi shook her head. "No." Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, "Master, I want to learn this sword manipulation technique." Yu Qi's chopsticks suddenly stopped. She looked at Yi Xian with some surprise. "You don't know how to control the sword?" Yi Xian nodded. "I don't know." Yu Qi shook her head. "A sword master who doesn't know how to control the sword, what does it look like?" Speaking of this, she seemed to have thought of something. "Later, come to my inner hall to look for a cultivation technique called True Sword Manipulation Technique. This cultivation technique is personally created by me. It's not something that ordinary sword manipulation techniques can compare to. Remember, don't teach it to others. True sword manipulation technique. Yi Xian hurriedly nodded. Yes, yes. Yu Qi nodded slightly. She pointed to the mushroom stir-fried cabbage in front of her. Not bad. Continue to make this dish tomorrow. Yi Xian. After the meal, Yu Qi left the hall. No one knew where she went. As for Yi Xian, after tidying up, he hurriedly entered the inner hall. The inner hall wasn't big. It was filled with cabinets. On each cabinet, there were many scrolls. Among them were cultivation techniques, martial techniques, and divine arts. All of them. Moreover, the lowest was earth rank. There were even heaven rank scrolls everywhere. Yi Xian was dumbfounded. At this moment, he realized that this cloudy sword peak was actually the F*King Azure Sword Sect's Martial Technique Library and Cultivation Technique Library. The scrolls in front of him were probably collected by the Azure Sword Sect over the generations. Some of them were created by the seniors of the Azure Sword Sect. Foundation. At this moment, Yi Xian truly understood what a foundation was. This was a foundation. This Azure Sword Sect was indeed a top force in the Azure Firmament world. Without much thought, Yi Xian began to search for the true sword manipulation technique. Soon he found it. Then, he began to search for Yu Qi's annotations. However, no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find it. After an hour, he still couldn't find it. Therefore, he stopped searching. He was going to ask Yu Qi when he returned. Or rather, he was going to ask Yu Qi directly. Yi Xian carried the true sword manipulation technique out of the hall and went straight to the back mountain. After Yi Xian had left the hall, a woman and a middle-aged man showed up at the entrance of the hall. These two people were Yu Qi and Chen Beihan. The two people looked at Yi Xian, who was running in the distance. Chen Beihan suddenly said, "During this time, he only chose instant space sword?" Yu Qi nodded. Chen Beihan asked again, "He didn't take away any of the cultivation techniques and martial techniques in the hall?" Yu Qi nodded again. Chen Beihan smiled and said, "That's interesting. If it was a rogue cultivator, it would be impossible for him not to be tempted by these things." At this point, he looked at Yu Qi. Did he really cultivate that instant space sword to the extreme in just a few days? Yu Qi said softly, "Everyone has their own secrets. It's enough that he doesn't have any bad intentions towards our sect." Chen Beihan said with a smile. Although he didn't save Lan Yu on Myriad Island, he saved Bailey Yun and those two little fellows. This proves that he isn't a heartless person. Since junior sister thinks he's not bad, then let him stay here and cultivate. He's indeed a good seedling. If you nurture him well, he will definitely achieve great things in the future. After saying that, he turned and disappeared on the spot. After Chen Beihan left, Yu Qi also turned and left. When she returned to the inner hall, there was a small table in the inner hall. On the small table, there were 3 plates of small fruits. Seeing this small table, Yu Qi said softly, "How thoughtful." Back mountain. Yi Xian held the sword-driving technique in his arms as he dashed madly all the way until he stopped before a pool of water. After he stopped, Yi Xian opened the sword-driving technique. Sword-driving technique relies on the heart and not the form. The heart and soul are united, and man and sword are one. Just like that, Yi Xian read and read for an hour before he stopped, and then he sat cross-legged on the ground and started to analyze it in his mind. Around 2 hours later, he suddenly formed a sword seal, and it wasn't long before a true rank sword suddenly flew out from within him and descended firmly in front of him. Yi Xian pressed his fingers against the sword, and it trembled violently before it emanated a resounding sword howl. Yi Xian was overjoyed when he saw this, and he hurriedly leaped up and descended onto the sword. However, the sword had almost sunk into the ground. Yi Xian hurriedly calmed himself, and the sword gradually started to stabilize. Once it was stable enough, Yi Xian suddenly started to speak softly, "Rise!" As soon as he spoke, the sword beneath his feet started to rise slowly. It was slightly slow, but it was constantly rising. 3 m, 6 m, 15 m, 30 m. In just a moment, he was over 100 m above the ground, and he was able to see Cloud's word hole in the distance. He was excited. Being able to control a sword was undoubtedly the dream of every swordsman. In the sky, Yi Xian's sword control grew higher and higher. However, he was too excited to notice that the sword beneath his feet was trembling. Just like that, after rising over 500 m, the sword beneath Yi Xian's feet suddenly trembled violently, and then it fell swiftly to the ground. Ah! Yi Xian's scream instantly resounded from the sky. A few breaths of time later. Bang! The ground beneath him trembled violently, and a huge amount of dust flew into the air. On the ground, Yi Xian rubbed his butt. That really fucking hurts. After resting for a moment, Yi Xian continued. Time passed slowly, and at dawn the next day, a man arrived at the foot of Pale Sword Sect's mountain. The man wore a plain robe and a pair of cloth shoes, and his eyes were dark violet. The man raised his head and glanced at Pale Sword Sect. According to rumor, Pale Sword Sect's younger generation is an outstanding genius. I'm Yi Xian, and I've come to seek guidance. When he spoke up to hear, he paused slightly and continued. To determine who's stronger and who lives and dies. Chapter 282. Yi Xian. The entire Blue Sword Sect was shocked. This second on the wanted list actually came to challenge Blue Sword Sect? Soon, an elder of Blue Sword Sect appeared in front of the linen-clothed man. This elder sized up the linen-clothed man. You are Yi Xian? The linen-clothed man nodded. Azure Province, Yi Xian. The elder looked at Yi Xian for a long time before shaking his head. You don't look like Yi Xian, and it's impossible for you to be Yi Xian. The linen-clothed man was expressionless. I am. The elder said, Yi Xian and the Realm Protecting Alliance have a great enmity. Under normal circumstances, he definitely wouldn't make an enemy out of my Blue Sword Sect. Yi Xian isn't that stupid. The linen-clothed man smiled. Why? Blue Sword Sect doesn't dare to accept my challenge? Or is there no one in the younger generation of Blue Sword Sect? The elder looked at the linen-clothed man, his eyes gradually turning cold. Someone was trying to cause trouble for the Blue Sword Sect. At this moment, a voice suddenly rang out from the top of the mountain. If he wants to challenge, then let him challenge. My Blue Sword Sect, be it in the past or now, has never been afraid of trouble. Disciples of the Seven Peaks, who is willing to come out and fight with me? Let me. At this time, a loud shout suddenly rang out from one of the main peaks. Following that, a sword light shot into the sky. But after it reached the sky, this sword light suddenly changed direction and steadily landed in front of the linen-clothed man. The sword light dissipated, revealing a man around 20 years of age. His skin was dark, his eyes sharp, and he held a sheathed sword in his hand. It's a Ray Dao Peak's senior brother Chen Yun. In the surroundings, people exclaimed. Chen Yun bowed to the elder beside him, then turned to look at the linen-clothed man. Make your move. The linen-clothed man said indifferently. If I make my move, you won't have a chance to do so. Chen Yun wasn't angry. It seems like you are very confident in yourself. Then let me experience your strength. As the sound of his voice faded, his left thumb suddenly flickered. Chi! The sword in the scabbard flew out at an incomparably fast speed. The linen-clothed man was expressionless. When the sword arrived in front of him, he didn't dodge, but when the sword was only an inch away from him, he suddenly moved to the side and dodged the sword by a hair's breadth. At the same time, his right hand grabbed Chen Yun's sword. At the sight of this, the Pale Sword Sect's elder's expression instantly changed. Chen Yun's eye, who was about to attack, was also stunned. The man glanced at Chen Yun, and in the next moment, his right foot lightly tapped the ground. Chi! The linen-clothed man appeared in front of Chen Yun like a ghost, causing Chen Yun's expression to change drastically. He was just about to attack when the linen-clothed man's speed was faster than him, and he directly grabbed Chen Yun by the throat. At the same time, the linen-clothed man's right foot kicked Chen Yun's knees twice. With the sound of two bones breaking, Chen Yun knelt down. The surroundings were deathly silent. Utter defeat. The linen-clothed man didn't kill Chen Yun, and he retreated a few meters instead. He glanced indifferently at Chen Yun, who knelt there. Is the younger generation of the Pale Sword Sect filled with trash like this? When he spoke up to hear, he raised his head to look at the other peaks. If so, then all of you can attack me together.
Don't waste my Yi Xian's time. Attack together. As soon as these words were spoken, it had undoubtedly infuriated all the disciples of the Pale Sword sect. In next to no time, numerous rays of light shot into the sky from the various peaks, and it wasn't long before a few dozen swordsmen stood before the linen-clothed man. The linen-clothed man had an emotionless expression on his face. Let's do it together. Meanwhile, a man walked out from the group of swordsmen. I'll do it. Everyone gazed at the man. The man wore a short shirt and had 2 swords hanging from his waist. It's the Shenzhen Peak senior brother Gu Lin. I never expected that he would actually come out as well. What's there to not expect? This Yi Xian humiliated our Pale Sword sect so much. How could senior brother Gu Lin and the others not come out? I wonder if senior brother Nangong Yen of the Pale Sword Peak is in the sect. There's no need for senior brother Nangong Yen. Senior brother Gu Lin is enough. Gu Lin walked in front of Chen Yun and helped him up. Behind him, the disciples of the Pale Sword sect immediately ran over to support Chen Yun. Chen Yun wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. Be careful. He's very strong. Gu Lin nodded. He looked at the linen-clothed man. Rumor has it that Yi Xian is also a swordsman, and also a sword emperor, the youngest sword emperor in our Azure world. However, you don't use a sword. The linen-clothed man said indifferently. None of you are qualified to make me, Yi Xian, draw my sword. The moment these words were spoken, the disciples of the Pale Sword sect were instantly enraged. Gu Lin glanced at the linen-clothed man. Please enlighten me. As the sound of his voice faded, he suddenly dashed forward. This dash was as fast as lightning. An array of sword light instantly appeared in front of the linen-clothed man. The linen-clothed man's expression was incomparably calm. When the sword was only half an inch away from his forehead, his body suddenly slanted backwards, very easily dodging the sword. At the same time, his right leg suddenly kicked out at Gu Lin's wrist. Pang! Gu Lin's entire arm was directly sent flying, but at this moment, Gu Lin's left hand suddenly pulled out a sword and slashed forward. The linen-clothed man blocked with his fingers, and this finger actually forcefully blocked Gu Lin's sword. At the same time, he dashed forward and suddenly kicked Gu Lin's abdomen with his knee. Pang! Gu Lin's entire body instantly flew tens of feet away. After landing, Gu Lin's body twitched, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. Another complete defeat. The scene was incomparably silent. The linen-clothed man clapped his hands and looked at the elder beside him. Is there no one else in the Pale Sword sect? Or is it that the Pale Sword sect is full of such trash? The elder took a deep look at the linen-clothed man, and only now did he realize that his eyes were blind. This linen-clothed man in front of him was not simple. The elder turned to look at the Pale Sword Peak, and after a moment he nodded slightly, and then turned to look at the linen-clothed man. Can you wait for an hour? The linen-clothed man said indifferently. Sure. The elder turned to look at the Pale Sword sect disciples. Without my order, no one is allowed to make a move. With that, he soared into the sky on his sword. The linen-clothed man slowly closed his eyes to rest. There were only 3 people in the Azure Sword Hall, Zhang Xian, Chen Bei Han, and a Pale Sword sect elder named Li Han, who was in charge of the Pale Sword sect's intelligence. Zhang Xian looked at Li Han. Did you find out that person's true identity? Li Han shook his head. Not a single clue. Zhang Xian's face sank, and he asked again, what about Yi Xian's whereabouts? Li Han still shook his head. After this person left Cold North sect, there was no news of him, as though he had vanished into thin air. Other than that, I received news that the Realm Protection Alliance, Sky Cloud City and several other powerhouses are looking for this person's whereabouts. Zhang Xian frowned. Even the Realm Protection Alliance has not been able to find him? Li Han nodded. This person is very mysterious, and he himself is not simple. Zhang Xian went silent for a moment, and then looked at Chen Beihan. Chen Beihan shook his head. My Pale Sword sect has been quiet for so many years. Some people really think that we are a soft persimmon, and can be easily bullied. Speaking of this, he looked at Li Han. How long will that kid Nangong take to return to the sect? Li Han said in a deep voice. 1 hour, at most 1 hour. Chen Beihan nodded slightly, and as though he thought of something, he said again. Inform Shangyu, ask him to return to the sect immediately. Shangyu. In the hall, Zhang Xian and Li Han were instantly stunned. Cloudy Sword Peak. At noon,
Yi Xian did not continue to practice the imperial sword technique, but made a table full of dishes. Inside the hall, Yi Xian and Xueqi sat facing each other. Xueqi was a man of few words, but Yi Xian was very talkative. During the meal, he would try to find all kinds of topics to talk about, and Xueqi would sometimes reply with a few words, and other times he would just say, N. When they were about to finish eating, Xueqi suddenly said, "You seem to have told me before that your name is Yi Xian?" Yi Xian was stunned for a moment, then nodded, "Yes." Xueqi glanced at Yi Xian. A person came down from the mountain, claiming to be Yi Xian, saying that he wants to challenge all the younger generation of our Pale Sword sect. Yi Xian. Yi Xian was instantly stunned. Very quickly, Yi Xian's face turned cold. Someone was impersonating him again. Realm Protection Alliance. Even if you used your toes to think, you would know that this was definitely done by the Realm Protection Alliance. After a moment of silence, Yi Xian suddenly put down his chopsticks. "Master Yu, I'll go and see who is so arrogant to dare to challenge our Pale Sword sect." With that, he got up and walked out of the hall. Just as Yi Xian walked out of the hall, Xueqi's voice came from inside the hall. "Don't attack, that person is very strong." Yi Xian did not answer, but ran down the mountain of Pale Sword sect. Inside the hall, Xueqi said softly, "Yi Xian? Is he very famous?" As she spoke, she continued to eat. Not long after, Yi Xian arrived at the foot of the mountain. At this moment, there were already nearly 200 people gathered there. All of them were Pale Sword sect disciples. Moreover, Yi Xian noticed the man in linen clothes not too far away. Yi Xian was instantly infuriated when he saw the man in linen, so he charged at the man in linen at an extremely fast speed like a ray of light. In an instant, he arrived in front of the man in linen, and then, under the gazes of countless people, he slashed with his sword. A single strike to decide life and death. The strength contained within this strike was like an erupting volcano, and a powerful force instantly swept out. The man in linen clothes instantly opened his eyes when he sensed this energy, and there was a trace of solemnity in his eyes. In the next moment, he moved his right foot lightly to the right and formed a seal with both hands before he suddenly pushed it forward. A strange ripple surged out from his hand's seal. Bang! As soon as the two forces collided, they suddenly erupted, and then both of them were pushed back repeatedly by over 100 m. Moreover, the ground before them had been transformed into an enormous pit. It was caused by the two forces from before. Everyone here was stunned when they witnessed this scene, and then countless gazed at Yi Xian. Who's this fellow? Yi Xian had just joined the Pale Sword sect, and coupled with the fact that he was often at Cloudsword Peak and practically never left, practically no disciple of the Pale Sword sect besides Bailey Yun and Gu Yu recognized him. The man who stood before Yi Xian glanced at Yi Xian. "Who are you?" "I'm your father." Yi Xian suddenly spoke furiously. "What kind of trash is this? How dare you pretend to be me? How dare you cause trouble in my Pale Sword sect? I'll fucking kill you." As soon as he finished speaking, he charged at the man with his sword in hand. A disciple of the Pale Sword sect was slightly dumbstruck. This senior brother is so violent. P.S. There are 3 more days until the new year. I've been writing for 4 years without realizing it, and I'm 18 years old this year. Time waits for no man. I hope everyone is well. Chapter 283. At this moment, everyone was staring curiously at Yi Xian. In the distance, when Yi Xian rushed to the man in linen clothes with his sword in hand, he swung his sword down. The man in linen clothes narrowed his eyes and raised his fingers to block Yi Xian's sword. Surprisingly, he managed to block Yi Xian's sword. At the same time, his other hand had already smashed towards Yi Xian's head. Yi Xian had never been afraid of close combat. He immediately tilted his head and dodged the punch. At the same time, he kicked towards the man's abdomen, and the man also kicked out. Bang! With a muffled sound, both of them retreated rapidly. This time, they retreated more than 100 meters. But this time, both of them were equally matched. The man glanced at Yi Xian. "I never thought that besides Xiongyu, there would be another monster in the Pale Sword sect. He's really hidden well. However, Yi Xian." "Yi Xian?" Yi Xian suddenly laughed. "You say you're Yi Xian?" The man said indifferently. "Is there a problem?" Yi Xian smiled. Everyone knows, Yi Xian is the Sword Emperor. Speaking up to here, he pointed at the man. Come, let us see if you're the Sword Emperor. If you are, then you're Yi Xian. If not, then you're an imposter to frame me. The man stared at Yi Xian with an expressionless face. You're not qualified for me to draw my sword. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly took a step forward. With this step, the ground in front of Yi Xian suddenly cracked, and then a fist mark flashed out. Yi Xian smiled coldly, dashed forward, and slashed down with his sword. Bang! The fist seal shattered with a loud rumble. After shattering the fist mark, Yi Xian grinned. You're too weak. As soon as he finished speaking, the sword in his hand suddenly shot out like a bolt of lightning. The man in linen clothes who stood before Yi Xian took a step forward and pointed his finger forward. The space before him instantly trembled before it rippled like water, and this spatial ripple actually forcefully shattered Yi Xian's sword light and forced Yi Xian's sword to stop moving. The spell defensive state. A wave of exclamations resounded in the surroundings. To be able to use the power of space to this extent, one had to be at least in the Dharma defensive realm. Moreover, he might even be very close to the true defensive Dharma state. In the air, Yi Xian's sword stopped as if it had been frozen by an invisible force. At this moment, Yi Xian made a grabbing motion towards his sword with his right hand. This grabbing motion. Kacha! Something seemed to have shattered, and then the sword that was frozen in midair suddenly shot towards the linen-clothed man. The linen-robed man's expression changed slightly when he saw this, and he brought his hands together in front of him. Boom! With this, he directly held Yi Xian's sword in his palm. However, at this moment, a sword silently appeared behind his head. Instant space slash. At this moment, the man in linen clothes was shocked. He stomped his right foot on the ground and disappeared from where he was. When he reappeared, he was already more than 100 feet behind Yi Xian. However, there was a deep sword wound at the back of his head, and blood was flowing out from it. That strike just now had almost taken his life. The linen-clothed man glared at Yi Xian. Who exactly are you? Yi Xian said seriously, since you keep asking, then I won't hide it anymore. Actually, I might be your long-lost father. The others in the surroundings were instantly stunned when they heard this, and then countless roars of laughter resounded like thunder in the surroundings. Hearing Yi Xian's words, the linen-clothed man's expression instantly turned cold. You're a monster, yet you don't know how to respect the strong? Respect. Yi Xian laughed coldly. Why should I respect a lowly person like you who's pretending to be someone else? As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly tapped his right foot against the ground, and his figure instantly arrived above the linen-clothed man. At the same time, he held his sword with both hands and swung it down. In Yi Xian's opinion, he didn't dare to expose too much. Regardless of whether it was the sword of earth, his sword intent, or even his sword aura, he didn't dare to expose any of them. Once he did, then it was very likely that his identity would be exposed. A ferocious expression appeared on the linen-clothed man's face when he saw Chen Shi's attack. He suddenly pressed his fingers together and pressed them against his chest. In an instant, a powerful aura swept out from within him, and then he swiftly swung his fist upwards. Bang! The linen-clothed man was instantly blasted over 30 m away. As soon as he stopped moving, Yi Xian appeared in front of him again, and then Yi Xian swung his sword again. Yi Xian's attack was extremely simple, and it couldn't even be considered as a sword technique. However, it was extremely violent and effective. The linen-clothed man's expression changed drastically when he noticed the strength within Yi Xian's attack. He suddenly flashed 30 m back and avoided Yi Xian's attack. At the same time, he suddenly smashed his fist forward. Yi Xian was about to continue attacking when a powerful force suddenly surged out from the space in front of him. Yi Xian hurriedly raised his sword to block it. Bang! A muffled bang resounded as Yi Xian was blasted back repeatedly. But it wasn't long before he stomped his right foot on the ground and instantly stopped moving. Yi Xian shook his slightly numb hand, and then he looked up at the linen-clothed man. Not only was the man before him at the law control realm, he was definitely at the law control realm when he was at the law realm. If he didn't expose his trump cards, then even though he could kill the man with his current strength, it would probably be a fierce battle. The linen-clothed man stared fixedly at Yi Xian. At this moment, there was a solemn expression in his eyes. After a moment of silence, The linen-clothed man suddenly opened his right hand, and a dark wheel of blades suddenly appeared at the center of his palm. As soon as this wheel of blades appeared, the expressions of all the disciples of the sword sect instantly changed. Because this wheel of blades was a heaven-rank treasure. A heaven-rank treasure. Yi Xian's brows knit together slightly. The linen-clothed man held the wheel of blades in his right hand while he suddenly formed a seal with his left hand. In the next moment, his entire body instantly became illusory. Subsequently, sharp sounds of slicing resounded all around Yi Xian. At the same time, numerous afterimages suddenly appeared around Yi Xian, and all of these afterimages held the wheel of blades in their hands and slashed at Yi Xian. Every single one of them seemed to be fake, yet they seemed to be real at the same time. It was difficult to distinguish the real from the fake. An illusion. If it was someone else, then it would definitely be useful. However, Yi Xian didn't have eyes. He'd always been looking at the world with his heart. Under the gazes of everyone present, Yi Xian suddenly stabbed towards the right, and a strand of light flashed on the tip of his sword. Clang! The countless afterimages instantly dispersed, and only Yi Xian and the linen-clothed man remained. At this moment, the wheel of blades that the linen-clothed man slashed at Yi Xian had just been blocked by Yi Xian's sword. However, numerous cracks had appeared on Yi Xian's sword. Obviously, the true rank couldn't compare to the heaven rank. Suddenly, Yi Xian twisted his right hand. Bang! The linen-clothed man retreated by over 30 m, but numerous more cracks had appeared on the sword in Yi Xian's hand. Yi Xian's expression sank when he sensed the changes in his sword. His expression sank. Under the circumstances that he couldn't expose his strength, he was utterly unable to protect this sword. Because this sword was unable to go against a heaven-rank spirit artifact without the boost of his sword intent. On the other hand, he couldn't withdraw his heaven-rank sword, because it would be too conspicuous if he did that. When they saw Yi Xian's sword, the expressions of all the disciples of the Blue Sword sect had turned gloomy. The current situation was slightly disadvantageous to Yi Xian. Right at this moment, the linen-clothed man suddenly tossed the wheel of blades in his hand, and it flew towards the top of Yi Xian's head. In next to no time, countless blades shot out violently from within the wheel of blades and slashed directly at Yi Xian. Yi Xian flashed backwards, and he pressed his sword against the center of his forehead. Under the gazes of countless people, Yi Xian suddenly let go of the sword in his hand. The sword flew out. A resounding sword howl suddenly resounded through the sky. After that, countless illusory swords suddenly appeared in the sky above Yi Xian, and they completely blocked the wheel of blades. The disciples of the Blue Sword sect in the surroundings were stunned when they witnessed this scene. What sort of sword technique is that? Meanwhile, someone exclaimed with shock. Void Flash. That's Void Flash. It's Void Flash that's cultivated to its limits. When Void Flash was cultivated to its limits, then it actually didn't consist of a single sword but countless swords. Because Void Flash represented speed, and speed meant that numerous swords could be formed. It wasn't possible to cultivate an ordinary sword technique to its limits, but it was extremely difficult to cultivate a heaven-rank sword technique to its limits. On the other hand, if Yi Xian didn't possess the spatial Dao laws, then it would be impossible for him to cultivate swordsman Void Flash to such an extent. At the very least, it would be impossible in a short period of time. The linen-clothed man who stood before Yi Xian had an extremely unsightly expression on his face. He hadn't imagined that his killer move would actually be destroyed by Yi Xian just like that. The linen-clothed man was just about to attack when Yi Xian suddenly vanished on the spot. In the next moment, Yi Xian had appeared in front of the linen-clothed man. The linen-clothed man had a ferocious expression on his face as he swiftly swung the wheel of blades in his hand. On the other hand, Yi Xian's sword stabbed towards the linen-clothed man's throat. He didn't block it. Everyone in the surroundings was stunned when they witnessed this scene. Is Yi Xian intending to exchange his life for another's? The linen-clothed man was quite astounded as well. Obviously, he hadn't expected that Yi Xian would be so resolute and actually not choose to block it. What should I do now? In practically an instant, the linen-clothed man had decided. He would exchange his life for another's. Because if he were to make a move now, then he would instantly be in a disadvantageous position and might even be killed. At a moment like this, it was a competition of courage and courage. The one who was afraid of death might be the one to die first. At this moment, time seemed to have frozen here. Everyone stared at the sword and wheel of blades in the distance. Both of them had descended onto Yi Xian and the linen-clothed man at practically the exact same moment. Bang! Hiss! A silhouette flew out in an instant, and this time, he flew a full 1,000 feet away. This figure was exactly Yi Xian, and the linen-clothed man stood on the spot. After a short moment, Yi Xian stood up slowly while blood flowed incessantly from the corner of his mouth. It was like a breached dam. However, he wasn't dead. He forcefully withstood it. In the distance, there was a sword stuck in the man's throat. The man in linen clothes stared at Yi Xian. Why? Why? Yi Xian patted his chest. Soon, a thin armor covered his entire body, including his head. Yi Xian smirked. I have a heavenly armor. Are you angry? Are you angry? Haha. Chapter 284. The man's body twitched when he heard Yi Xian's words, and then he stopped breathing. No one knew if he died from serious injuries or from anger. As for the surrounding crowd, after being stunned for a moment, countless Pale Sword sect disciples cheered in unison. Besides excitement, there was also respect when they looked at Yi Xian. This respect wasn't just because of Yi Xian's strength, but also because Yi Xian had stood up at the critical moment and protected the Pale Sword sect's face. And the Pale Sword sect's face was their face. Yi Xian hurriedly walked over to the man and put away the spatial ring and the heaven-ranked treasure. After that, he cupped his fists towards the surroundings. Everyone, I still have something to do. See you later. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and ran. Everyone. Somewhere else, Song Xian and Chen Beihan silently watched Yi Xian from afar. Chen Beihan smiled. How is it? Song Xian was silent for a moment, and then he said, he should still be concealing his strength. He hesitated for a moment, and then he said, although he did a meritorious deed this time, his background is still a little mysterious. We still have to pay attention to him. Chen Beihan said softly, do you still have resentment in your heart? Song Xian smiled bitterly. Senior brother, am I such a narrow-minded person? I'm indeed angry that Lan Yu suffered such a huge loss this time, but it's not to the extent that I would purposely suppress the disciples of my Pale Sword sect, especially such an outstanding disciple. Chen Beihan nodded slightly. I'm glad that you think that way. Competition is fine in the sect, but it must be healthy. Many ancient clans and sects are destroyed not because of external factors, but because of internal strife. Song Xian said seriously, don't worry, senior brother, that girl has the intention to repent and will not do anything extreme. As for me, I won't either. Chen Beihan smiled. Don't spoil that girl too much. She's unruly, and if she doesn't suffer a loss, there will be even more trouble in the future. It might not be a bad thing for her if she learns her lesson this time. Song Xian nodded. Understood. Chen Beihan turned to look at the cloud's word peak and said softly, as for this young man's background, don't worry, I already know it. Song Xian's expression relaxed slightly. That's good. Chen Beihan retracted his gaze and said, the latest news is that the Realm Defense Alliance might be closing their net in the Azure Province. If it's slow, it'll take half a month. If it's fast, it'll take 5 days. Song Xian said in a low voice, if Qing Prefecture is gone, will the Realm Defense Alliance's next target be the Divine Central Continent? Chen Beihan chuckled. They're already attacking the Central Divine Prefecture. Song Xian exclaimed. How dare they? The few families in the Upper Realm and the Celestial Sect of Wonders agree. Chen Beihan smiled. That's what I want to know as well. I want to see if the Realm Defense Alliance dares to provoke public anger. If they dare, then the sky will really change. Hearing this, the expressions of the two gradually turned grave. Cloud Sword Peak. After returning to the main hall, Yi Xian immediately laid down on the ground. Healing. In the Tsong Sword sect, he certainly did not dare to enter the World Prison Pagoda at will. Therefore he could only heal outside. In the previous battle, he had been seriously injured because he had held back his strength, especially the last time. Although he had used a heaven-grade armor to block the knife wheel, it did not mean that he was completely unscathed. A heaven-grade armor could not withstand all the power. A large portion of the power had still fallen on him. This chapter is not over. Please continue to the next page. Fortunately, it was not fatal, but it was uncomfortable. About 2 hours later, Yi Xian felt much better. At this moment, Xueqi walked up to him. The first sword you used earlier was quite strange. The first sword. Yi Xian was stunned, and then he cursed inwardly. Oh no! He had used the first sword to determine life and death. He had thought that no one would be able to discover it, but Xueqi had. But this was normal. Given Xueqi's knowledge and ability, as long as he saw it, he would definitely be able to see how extraordinary this sword was. When she saw Yi Xian remain silent, Xueqi nodded slightly. I'm just curious. Yi Xian smiled. Master Yu, that sword is called Life and Death. It was taught to me by a senior. She said that it wasn't a sword technique, but a form of faith in the sword Tao. Faith in the sword Tao. Xueqi blinked, and then she fell into deep thought. Around 15 minutes later, she gazed at Yi Xian and said, What else did that senior say about this sword technique? Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, She said that if I draw my sword, then you will live if I want you to live, and you will die if I want you to die. So, it's called life and death. Xueqi was stunned. After a short moment, she started to pace up and down within the hall. After a long time, she stopped and gazed at Yi Xian with an extremely serious expression. Is that senior still here? Yi Xian shook his head. A trace of disappointment flashed through Xueqi's eyes. She thought for a moment before she gazed at Yi Xian and said, It's a form of faith in the sword Tao, and in order to attain such faith, simply speaking, a person must read widely before he can write a peerlessly good article. He must possess abundant knowledge and personal experience. Only in this way would he be able to write a peerlessly good article. When she spoke up to here, she paused slightly and continued, It's the same for the sword Tao. If you really want to attain the state of life and death with a single strike of the sword, then you must take it step by step. You must create your own sword Tao and possess your own faith in the sword Tao. As she spoke up to here, her gaze suddenly became slightly complicated. She didn't teach you a sword technique or faith in the sword Tao. Instead, she opened up a path in the sword Tao in your mind. Even if you walk slowly along this path, you won't get lost or stop moving forward. Yi Xian's heart suddenly felt slightly warm when he heard this. A mysterious woman. He didn't know her name or where she came from, but he really liked being with her. To put it simply, it gave him a F***king sense of security. At this moment, Xueqi suddenly said, If the senior you speak of appears in the future, can you introduce him to me if there's a chance? Yi Xian smiled and said, Of course, no problem. Xueqi nodded slightly. She took out a white jade bottle and placed it in front of Yi Xian. This is a purple source pill. I was going to give it to you just now, but I saw you eat 2 or 3 in one go. Am I too poor? Yi Xian. Xueqi patted Yi Xian's shoulder lightly. Since your injuries have healed, then make some food. Remember, it's mushroom stir-fried cabbage. Don't add too much salt. After speaking, she turned around and walked into the inner hall. Yi Xian. A moment later, Yi Xian began to check the storage ring. There were a total of 1 billion supreme-grade spirit stones in the storage ring. When he saw this number, Yi Xian was completely dumbfounded. So rich. In addition to the supreme-grade spirit stones and the heaven-grade saber wheel, there were also some true-grade treasures worth about 200 to 300 million. Right now, he was a supreme-grade treasure. This chapter is not over, please continue to the next page. There were exactly 2 billion spirit stones. In addition to the supreme-grade spirit stones, there were 2 heaven-grade swords, a heaven-grade armor, a high-grade heaven-grade spear, incineration, and a saber wheel. In addition, there were also over 20 rotten corpses. Of course, there was also the Situ family history and the patriarch's token. If he used these 2 well, he would have an endless source of wealth. Of course, there was one thing that he couldn't forget, and that was the Realm Defense Alliance. The Realm Defense Alliance had sent people to impersonate him several times to stir up trouble in Blue Sword Sect. It was highly likely that the Realm Defense Alliance had already guessed that he was in Blue Sword Sect, or perhaps they believed him and really felt that the person behind him was the Blue Sword Master. When he thought of this, Yi Xian slowly clenched his fists. No matter what, he had to be careful. He had to learn the sword control technique first. As long as he learned it well, it would take him at most a day to return to Azure Prefecture from the Central Divine Prefecture. Yi Xian didn't think too much about it and started a fire outside to cook. Around an hour later, Xueqi smelled the fragrance of the food and came out. Realm Defense Alliance. Within the hall, High Lord Lu sat on a chair with his eyes closed, and his body emanated a faint aura. After an unknown period of time, Emoshio walked in. He glanced at High Lord Lu and said in a low voice, "It's been confirmed. Yi Xian is in Blue Sword Sect, and he has changed his name to An Yi." High Lord Lu opened his eyes. "That old fellow, Old Chen, knows his identity?" Emoshio said in a low voice, "I don't know. But according to my guess, he should be able to guess it." When he spoke up to hear, he hesitated for a moment and looked at High Lord Lu. "Why don't we ask Blue Sword Sect for him directly?" High Lord Lu said indifferently, "If we ask directly, they will absolutely not give it to us. Moreover, it will alert them and allow Yi Xian to escape once more." Emoshio frowned. "Why not?" High Lord Lu laughed coldly. "It's not like you don't know about the enmity between my Realm Defense Alliance and Blue Sword Sect. Even though 1,000 years have passed, how could the members of my Realm Defense Alliance forget the humiliation we suffered all those years ago? Moreover, the Blue Sword Sect's founding ancestor, the Blue World Swordmaster, even said that even if Blue Sword Sect was annihilated, they would never compromise with the Realm Defense Alliance. If I want it openly, then I'll be forcing Blue Sword Sect to go to war with us right now." Emoshio's face sank when he heard this. The enmity between the Realm Defense Alliance and Blue Sword Sect was something everyone knew about many years ago. After all, a High Lord of the Realm Defense Alliance had been beaten to death by the Blue World Sword Master. For 1,000 years, both sides had tried their best to coexist peacefully. But if the Realm Defense Alliance asked Blue Sword Sect for Yi Xian, Blue Sword Sect would definitely not give it to them. Not only would they not give it to them, but they would also allow Yi Xian to escape once more. Emoshio shook his head. "This matter is a little difficult. The Realm Defense Alliance definitely wasn't afraid of Blue Sword Sect, but Blue Sword Sect wasn't afraid of the Realm Defense Alliance either. If it was during normal times they would fight. But now that the Realm Defense Alliance wanted to snatch Qingzhou's origin heart, if they started a war with Blue Sword Sect, their plan would be a mess. Blue Sword Sect wasn't like the Cold North Sect, they couldn't just scare them." In the hall, after a moment of silence, High Lord Lu suddenly said, "Let's ignore this Yi Xian for now. Let the Devil Sect and Ghost Sect speed up." As he said this, he seemed to have thought of something and his eyes narrowed. "No, we can't ignore Yi Xian first. If we let Blue Sword Sect fully nurture him, with this person's talent." As he said this, he suddenly stood up. "Let's get rid of Yi Xian first. P.S. What kind of person am I in your hearts? Please be bold." End of this chapter. Chapter 285. Get rid of Yi Xian. The reason High Lord Lu had suddenly changed his mind was because he'd suddenly thought of something, and it was the speed of Yi Xian's growth. After all, Yi Xian was the Sword Emperor now. If Yi Xian attained the Sword Immortal Realm, then it would be extraordinarily difficult for the Realm Defense Alliance to kill him. Moreover, even if they could kill him, they would probably have to pay a huge price. It couldn't be delayed. The longer it was delayed, the bigger the problem would be. When he heard High Lord Lu, Emoshio said in a low voice, "How do we kill him?" High Lord Lu fell silent. How to kill him was another problem. At this moment, Yi Xian had already become difficult to kill. Right at this moment, Emoshio suddenly said, "I have a plan." High Lord Lu looked at Emoshio, and the latter said in a low voice, "How about this?" Around an hour later, Emoshio left the audience hall. Pale Sword Sect. Cloud's Word Peak. At the peak of the rear mountain, Yi Xian formed a sword seal with his hands, and then a sword suddenly flew out from within his body and fell firmly in front of him. Yi Xian flew onto the sword, and in the next moment, he pressed his fingers together and pointed forward. Hiss! The sword shot out violently, and in an instant, it was already 300 m away. 300 m away. Yi Xian suddenly shouted lightly. "Rise!" As soon as his voice resounded. "OM!" Along with a sword howl, the sword beneath Yi Xian's feet suddenly transformed into a ray of light that shot into the sky at an extremely swift speed, and it didn't take long for it to arrive in the thick layer of clouds. At this moment, Yi Xian's heartbeat suddenly sped up, and it was truly too exciting. Sword Control Technique. I've finally learned the sword control technique. In his opinion, he wouldn't need to rely on something like a cloud ship to go anywhere in the future. Yi Xian didn't stop, and he continued cultivating because there were still many aspects of the sword control technique that he hadn't fully grasped. Just as Xueqi had said, learning the sword control technique was very simple, but it was extremely difficult. Not only did he have to learn, but he also had to learn well. About an hour later, Yi Xian arrived at the top of the mountain. At this time, Yi Xian landed steadily in front of her on his flying sword. Yi Xian grinned. Master Yu, do you think I'm a genius? Xueqi was puzzled. Why do you ask? Yi Xian patted his chest. I only spent less than 2 days to learn the imperial sword technique. Isn't that a genius? Xueqi looked at Yi Xian and frowned. 2 days? Back then I learned it in 1 day. Yi Xian was speechless. However, he still believed in Xueqi's words. Because during this period of time, he realized that Xueqi was actually a very honest person. He wouldn't lie. He would say what he said, and he would do what he said. At this time, Xueqi suddenly said, I saw your sword control just now, and there are some shortcomings. When you control the sword, you must not be impatient. You are very impatient, and this bad habit needs to be changed. Yi Xian quickly nodded. Understood. Xueqi continued, the imperial sword technique can borrow the power of the wind. Wind is invisible but it is powerful. You can make good use of it. In this way, Xueqi explained some details to Yi Xian and left. After Xueqi left, Yi Xian began to cultivate again. At this moment, he discovered that the imperial sword technique was actually very complicated. And his purpose in coming to Pale Sword Sect was to learn the imperial sword technique. Naturally, he had to learn it well. Otherwise, wouldn't he have come in vain? Just as Yi Xian was cultivating the imperial sword technique, a middle-aged man suddenly came to Pale Sword Sect. This chapter is not finished, please turn the page. This person was the Realm Guard Alliance's High Lord Lu. Chen Beihan personally welcomed him. Inside the hall, Chen Beihan looked at High Lord Lu and smiled. What wind blew Brother Lu here today? High Lord Lu was full of smiles. Brother Chen, to tell you the truth, I came here today because I have a request. Chen Beihan pretended to be unhappy. What request? Brother Lu, if you need anything, just let me know. High Lord Lu smiled. Since Brother Chen says so, then I won't stand on ceremony. I heard that your sect has recruited a new disciple called An Yi. Is that right? An Yi? Chen Beihan was taken aback, then turned to look at Song Xian not far away. Is there? Song Xian nodded. Yes. Chen Beihan looked at High Lord Lu who smiled and said, Can you let him come see me? Chen Beihan smiled. Of course, no problem. Not long after, Yi Xian came to the hall. When he saw High Lord Lu, Yi Xian's heart shivered. As expected, the other party had already guessed his identity. Chen Beihan looked at Yi Xian and said with a smile, An Yi, this High Lord Lu wants to see you. Yi Xian turned to High Lord Lu. High Lord Lu, speak quickly, I'm busy. Song Xian couldn't help but laugh when he heard this. Chen Beihan also shook his head with a smile. Little fellow, you should be more polite. The person in front of you is High Lord Lu of the Realm Defense Alliance. High Lord Lu stared at Yi Xian for a moment, and then he smiled. Young friend and is indeed a genius. It's rare for you to have such achievements at such a young age. As he spoke, he smiled. Of course, the prerequisite is that you don't die prematurely. Once you die, no matter how monstrous you are, you will only be a corpse. As soon as these words were spoken, the atmosphere here instantly became slightly tense. Yi Xian smiled. High Lord Lu is right. Over the years, there have indeed been some nobodies that want me dead. For example, a mad dog has been chasing me recently. But I can't help it, I'm lucky I can't die. That old dog is really angry. High Lord Lu's eyes narrowed, and his gaze turned icy cold. At this moment, Chen Beihan suddenly said, How can you speak to High Lord Lu like that? You don't know the rules at all. Leave. Yi Xian cupped his fists together, turned around, and left. After Yi Xian left, Chen Beihan looked at High Lord Lu and said apologetically, Brother Lu, this little fellow doesn't know any better. Please don't be calculative with him. High Lord Lu smiled. Brother Chen, to tell you the truth, I came here today because I have something to trouble you with. Chen Beihan smiled. Brother Lu, please speak your mind. High Lord Lu nodded and smiled. I want to take that young man and Yi away. Chen Beihan shook his head decisively. No. High Lord Lu looked Chen Beihan in the eye. Brother Chen, our two sides have been very friendly for 1,000 years. Don't ruin this friendship because of an irrelevant person. Chen Beihan smiled. Brother Lu, what are you saying? My Blue Sword sect has never caused trouble. Of course, we aren't afraid of trouble either. But if you want to bully us, no one in my Blue Sword sect will agree. High Lord Lu looked at Chen Beihan for a long time. In the end he smiled. Good, very good. Then I ask Brother Chan and the Blue Sword sect to take care. With that, he turned around and left. After High Lord Lu left, the smile on Chen Beihan's face gradually faded. He should be Yi Xian. Song Xian suddenly said. Chen Beihan nodded. Song Xian said in a low voice, if that's the case, then we have completely offended the Realm Defense Alliance. Chen Beihan looked at Song Xian. Offended? As he spoke, this chapter is not finished, please continue to the next page. He shook his head and smiled. If it was before, my Blue Sword sect would definitely not interfere in the matter between Yi Xian and the Realm Defense Alliance, but now, Yi Xian is a member of my Blue Sword sect. Do you understand? Song Xian frowned. He may not be sincere in joining my Blue Sword sect. Chen Beihan said indifferently. Then let him sincerely join my Blue Sword sect. Song Xian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. This person has reached the Sword Emperor level at such a young age. His talent is definitely not bad. If he sincerely joins my Blue Sword sect, it will be a good thing for my Blue Sword sect. But I'm afraid the Realm Defense Alliance will not let this matter rest. Chen Beihan smiled. Without Yi Xian, they will not let this matter rest either. The ambition of the Realm Defense Alliance is already clear. Once they succeed, the first target will most likely be my Blue Sword sect. As he spoke, he got up and walked outside. You should know that the corpse of one of their supremes is still hanging in front of my Blue Sword sect. Unfortunately, it has already grown weeds. Let's see if we need to clean it up some other day. Also, you should personally make a trip to Qingzhou. Inside the hall, Song Xian shook his head with a sigh and turned to leave. Night. Cloud Sword Peak. Inside the main hall. Yi Xian and Yu Qi were sitting opposite each other, both of them eating. Just as they were about to finish, Yi Xian suddenly said, Master Yu, I might have to leave. Leave. Yu Qi put down his chopsticks and looked at Yi Xian. Leave the Blue Sword sect? Yi Xian nodded. I told you before, my name is Yi Xian, do you still remember? Yu Qi nodded. I remember, but are you very famous? Yi Xian smiled bitterly. Actually, this Yu Qi really did not know who Yi Xian was. Or in other words, Yu Qi knew very little about the outside world. Because Yu Qi liked to research all day, studying all kinds of mystic techniques and supernatural powers. Apart from that, she was not interested in anything else. At this time Yu Qi said again, Just now Supreme's Lu came, did he come for you? Yi Xian nodded. I am the one ranked second on the Blue World's wanted list. Yu Qi put down his chopsticks. Why are you wanted? Yi Xian smiled. The Realm Protection Alliance wants to destroy Qingzhou, and I am from Qingzhou, so I brought my group of brothers and had a lot of unpleasant things with them. Then they put me on the wanted list, wanting to kill me. That's about it. Yu Qi thought for a while then said, You are not wrong. Yi Xian smiled. Tonight's meal is my last. I will leave later. Yu Qi looked at him. Why do you want to leave? Yi Xian said, If I don't leave, I will implicate the Blue Sword sect. Yu Qi shook his head. No need to leave, the Blue Sword sect is not afraid of the Realm Protection Alliance. Yi Xian wanted to say something else, but Yu Qi suddenly said, The Blue Sword sect and the Realm Protection Alliance have always had enmity. All those years ago, a supremacy of the Realm Protection Alliance died at the hands of the founding ancestor, and his corpse was even at the foot of the mountain. After the founding ancestor left, the Realm Protection Alliance took revenge, and 3 sect masters of our Blue Sword sect died miserably, one of them being senior brother Beihan's father. When she spoke up to hear, she gazed at Yi Xian. All of these enmities are death grudges. It doesn't matter if you join us. As soon as she finished speaking, she stood up and patted Yi Xian lightly on the shoulder. Since you have joined my Blue Sword sect, then do your job well. We will deal with the Realm Protection Alliance. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and walked into the inner hall. Yi Xian remained silent on the spot for a long time. One day later, 10 coffins suddenly appeared at the foot of the Blue Sword Sect mountain, and within these coffins were the corpses of 10 Blue Sword Sect disciples. The entire Central Divine Prefecture was shocked. End of this chapter. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.